Imagine a world where your country's western border is just a river away, and beyond it lies a vast, uncharted wilderness, a complete mystery. For the young United States in the early 1800s, this wasn't imagination, it was reality. The mighty Mississippi River was the frontier, and beyond it stretched a territory so immense, so unknown, that it might as well have been another planet. This is the story of how that mystery was unraveled, how a nation's destiny was forged, and it all begins with the vision of one man, Thomas Jefferson. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're kicking off a new series, diving deep into one of the most epic journeys in American history. But before we meet the legendary explorers, we need to understand the man whose dream set everything in motion. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, was more than just a politician. He was a scholar, an inventor, a farmer, an architect, a true Renaissance man of his time. And above all, he was a visionary. While others saw the United States as a collection of states clinging to the Atlantic coast, Jefferson saw something much grander. He envisioned an empire of liberty, a sprawling republic of independent farmers stretching from sea. To him, the West wasn't a barrier. It was the future. This wasn't just some romantic daydream. Jefferson had a deep, scientific curiosity about the West. What plants grew there? What animals roamed its plains and mountains? What native cultures thrived in this unknown land? And, crucially, was there a water route, the famed Northwest Passage, that could connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, unlocking a gateway for trade with Asia? For decades, these questions burned in his mind. He had spent years collecting every map, every explorer's journal, every scrap of information he could find about the vast territory beyond the Mississippi. He knew more about this land than perhaps any other American. Yet he also knew how little was truly known. In the early 1800s, this vast western territory, known as Louisiana, belonged to Spain. But Jefferson kept a watchful eye on it. He feared that if a more powerful European nation, like France, under the ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte, were to take control, his dream of westward expansion would be blocked forever. America would be hemmed in, its destiny stunted. And then, in 1801, Jefferson's worst fears seemed to come true. In a secret treaty, Spain ceded the massive Louisiana territory back to France. Napoleon, with his grand ambitions of a global empire, now controlled the Mississippi River and the vital port of New Orleans, the gateway through which nearly half of America's trade flowed. It was a crisis. American farmers west of the Appalachians depended on that port to ship their goods to market. If Napoleon closed it, the economic consequences would be disastrous, potentially even tearing the young nation apart. Jefferson knew he had to act. Diplomacy was his first and preferred weapon. He dispatched his minister to France, Robert Livingston, with instructions to try and purchase New Orleans and a small part of Florida. The goal was modest: simply secure American access to the Gulf of Mexico. Jefferson even authorized Livingston to offer up to $10 million, a huge sum at the time, for just this small piece of land. To reinforce the urgency, he sent James Monroe to Paris as a special envoy to assist in the negotiations. What happened next is one of history's greatest surprises. When Monroe arrived in Paris in April 1803, the situation had dramatically changed. Napoleon's plans for a North American empire had crumbled. A massive slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, had defeated his best troops. Without this valuable sugar colony, Louisiana was far less useful to him. Furthermore, war with Britain was once again on the horizon, and Napoleon needed money, fast. He also knew that he could undefend the vast Louisiana territory from either the British or the encroaching Americans. So, Napoleon made a stunning counteroffer. Just before Monroe's arrival, his foreign minister turned to the shocked American diplomat Robert Livingston and asked, "What will you give for the whole of it?" The whole of it. Livingston could hardly believe his ears. Napoleon wasn't just offering New Orleans, he was offering the entire Louisiana territory. When Monroe arrived, the negotiations moved quickly. The French asked for a price, and the American envoy, operating far beyond their original instructions, made a bold decision. They agreed to a price of $15 million, about 3 cents an acre, for a territory of over 828,000 square miles. In a single stroke, without a single shot being fired, they had agreed to double the size of the United States. When news of the deal reached Washington, Jefferson was ecstatic, but also faced a constitutional dilemma. The Constitution said nothing about the federal government having the power to acquire new territory. Jefferson, a strict interpreter of the Constitution, was deeply troubled by this. He even considered pushing for a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase, but his advisors warned him that the process would take too long. Napoleon was notoriously fickle, and the deal could fall through at any moment. In the end, pragmatism won out over principle. Jefferson argued that the president's treaty-making powers implicitly allowed for the purchase. He urged Congress to ratify the treaty, declaring that the good sense of our country will correct the evil of construction when it shall produce ill effects. The Senate quickly approved the treaty in October 1803, and on December 20th, the American flag was raised over New Orleans. The Louisiana Purchase was complete. The nation was now twice as large, a vast expanse of land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. But what, exactly, had they bought? It was a giant question mark on the map. No one knew its precise boundaries, its geography, its resources, or its inhabitants. Jefferson's dream of an empire of liberty was now within reach, but it was an empire of ignorance. He needed answers. He needed to know what lay in this new American wilderness. He needed to find that fabled water route to the Pacific. He needed to establish trade and peaceful relations with the Native American tribes who called this land home. He needed to assert American sovereignty over this vast domain before other powers, like Britain or Spain, tried to claim parts of it. For this monumental task, he couldn't send just anyone. He needed more than just soldiers or trappers. He needed men who were tough and brave. Yes, but also intelligent, observant, disciplined, and diplomatic. He needed leaders who could command a team through unimaginable hardships. He needed scientists who could document the flora and fauna, cartographers who could map the rivers and mountains, and ambassadors who could represent the United States to the dozens of native nations they would encounter. Even before the Louisiana Purchase was finalized, Jefferson had already begun planning for such an expedition. The purchase only made the mission more urgent and more important. He had already secured funding from Congress for a course of discovery, a military expedition with a scientific heart. All he needed now were the right men to lead it. His search led him to a young, trusted aide, a man he knew possessed the courage, intellect, and leadership skills for this once-in-a-lifetime challenge, a man whose name would become forever linked with this great American adventure. The stage was set, the vision was in place, the land was acquired, and the mission was defined. The great unknown was waiting, and in our next chapter, we shall meet the remarkable leaders chosen to pierce that veil of mystery. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Thank you so much for joining us on this first leg of our journey. If you're as excited as I am to see what happens next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss a single episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine this. The year is 1803. President Thomas Jefferson, a man with a boundless curiosity for the vast, uncharted American West, has just sealed the deal of a lifetime. The Louisiana Purchase. Suddenly, the United States has doubled in size, but this new territory is a complete mystery. It's a land of sprawling prairies, towering mountains, and powerful rivers, all whispered about in vague rumors and embellished tales. Jefferson knows he needs more than just a map. He needs a story, a scientific record, an understanding of this new frontier. He envisions an expedition, a journey into the heart of the continent. But such a monumental task requires a leader of extraordinary caliber. This wasn't a job for just any soldier or politician. Jefferson needed someone with a unique blend of skills. He needed a commander, a diplomat, a scientist, and a survivalist all rolled into one. The person he chose would have to lead a team through unknown dangers, negotiate with Native American tribes whose lands they would cross, and meticulously document every new plant, animal, and geological feature they encountered. The success or failure of this epic venture The very first chapter of America's westward story would rest squarely on this leader. Shoulders, the stakes couldn't be higher. Who could possibly fit such a demanding and complex role? Enter Meriwether Lewis. At just 29 years old, Lewis was not only a captain in the U.S. Army, but also President Jefferson's personal secretary and protege. This wasn't a simple administrative role. Lewis lived in the presidential mansion, working side by side with Jefferson daily. He was privy to the president's grandest ambitions and his most detailed plans. Jefferson saw in Lewis more than just a loyal aide. He saw a kindred spirit. Lewis was intelligent, observant, and possessed a keen interest in the natural world. He was also known for his resilience and what Jefferson described as a firmness and perseverance of purpose. He had military experience, having served on the frontier, but it was his sharp mind and unwavering dedication that truly set him apart. Jefferson knew Lewis was the right man, but he also knew Lewis couldn't do it alone. The president decided to give his young secretary a crash course to prepare him for the immense scientific responsibilities of the mission. He sent Lewis to Philadelphia, the intellectual heart of the young nation. There, Lewis studied under the top minds of the day. He learned botany to identify and preserve plant specimens, zoology to document new animal species, and celestial navigation to accurately map their journey. He was essentially cramming a university education into a few intense months, transforming from a soldier into a field scientist, all under the president's direct guidance. Jefferson was personally investing in Lewis, molding him into the perfect instrument for his grand vision of Western exploration. With his scientific training underway, Lewis turned his attention to assembling the expedition, which he christened the Cause of Discovery. But as he planned the logistics, a crucial realization dawned on him. He needed a co-commander. He needed someone he could trust implicitly, a partner who could share the immense burden of command. This partner had to be more than just a subordinate. He needed to be an equal, someone whose skills complemented his own. He needed a seasoned frontiersman, an expert in river navigation, and a leader who could command the respect of rough-and-tumble soldiers in the wild. His mind immediately went to one man, and one man only. His old friend and former Army superior, William Clark. William Clark was, in many ways, Lewis's perfect counterpart. 4 years older than Lewis, Clark was a rugged, practical, and experienced outdoorsman. While Lewis was the thoughtful scientist and planner, Clark was the master of the field. He was a superb cartographer, a skilled boatman, and an expert at building forts and managing the day-to-day realities of life on the frontier. He had a natural, easy-going authority that made men follow him without question. Clark had retired from the army, but Lewis knew his friend's heart still belonged to the wilderness. On June 19, 1803, Lewis wrote a letter that would change the course of American history. He invited Clark to join him, promising him equal rank and pay. It was an extraordinary offer, a partnership built on deep mutual respect and friendship. Clark received the letter at his family's plantation near Louisville, Kentucky. The proposition was audacious. To venture thousands of miles into a complete unknown, facing unpredictable dangers with no promise of return, many would have hesitated, but not Clark. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. He accepted the offer without reservation, his adventurous spirit ignited by the grand scope of the mission. The partnership was sealed. Lewis and Clark, the intellectual and the pragmatist, the scientist and the frontiersman, were united. It was a leadership team forged not in a government office, but through the bonds of friendship and a shared passion for the untamed American landscape. Their combined strengths created a synergy that would prove essential for the trials ahead. However, there was a slight hiccup from the bureaucracy back east. The War Department, much to Lewis's frustration, refused to grant Clark a captain's commission, officially making him a lieutenant. Lewis was furious. He had given Clark his word. In an act of true partnership, Lewis decided to ignore the official decree. To the men of the Corps of Discovery, and for the entirety of their grueling journey, there was no distinction. They were Captain Lewis and Captain Clark, co-commanders, in every sense of the word. This quiet defiance set the tone for the entire expedition. A mission defined by loyalty, mutual respect, and a focus on getting the job done. no matter the obstacle. The leaders were chosen, the team was forming, and the great journey to the Pacific was about to begin. Thanks for watching this chapter of our series on the Lewis and Clark expedition. If you're enjoying this journey into American history, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. We've got a lot more ground to cover. See you in the next video. Imagine this. You're about to step into a world no one from your country has ever seen. What do you pack? A good map. Well, there isn't one. A reliable GPS? Not for another 200 years. This was the monumental task facing Meriwether Lewis in the winter of 1803. President Jefferson knew that for this mission to succeed, it needed more than just courage. It needed knowledge. So, he sent Lewis to the intellectual boot camp of the era. In Philadelphia, the nation's scientific heart, Lewis became a student once more. He wasn't just learning to read a compass, he was diving into the cosmos with the country's leading astronomers, learning to chart his position by the stars. He studied medicine under Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Lewis learned to diagnose fevers, set broken bones, and even perform minor surgery. Remember, he would be the only doctor for his entire crew, thousands of miles from any hospital. The men's lives would literally be in his hands. But the training didn't stop there. He plunged into botany, learning to identify plants. Which ones were edible, which were medicinal, and which were completely new to science. Every leaf, every root, could be a discovery or a disaster. He studied geography and cartography, absorbing everything known about the lands to the west, which, frankly, wasn't much beyond the Mississippi River. He was training not just to survive the unknown, but to document it, to map it, and to bring its secrets back to a waiting nation. This wasn't just a hike. It was a mobile scientific laboratory venturing into a continental mystery. While Lewis was cramming his mind with knowledge, the physical preparation of the cause of discovery was in full swing. This was a logistical puzzle on a grand scale. They were packing for a journey with no end date. Think about the sheer volume of supplies needed. They gathered 15 tons of it. That's the weight of about 10 cars. This included tons of flour, parched corn, and 50 bushels of salt for preserving meat. But survival wasn't just about food. They needed tools. Axes to build shelters, blacksmithing equipment for repairs, and scientific instruments to measure and record. And of course, they needed weapons, not just for hunting, but for defense. They stocked up on rifles, pistols, and a crucial supply of lead for making bullets, and 17,000 flints for their flintlock rifles. They even brought a small cannon, or swivel gun, to mount on their main boat. It was a show of force, a signal that this was a military expedition, backed by the authority of the United States. Every item was carefully chosen, a calculated bet against the countless challenges that lay ahead in the vast, uncharted wilderness. But Jefferson's vision was about more than just conquest or survival. It was about diplomacy. He understood that the success of the expedition hinged on their relationship with the dozens of Native American tribes they would encounter. These weren't empty lands. They were home to complex societies, and navigating this human landscape was as critical as navigating the Missouri River. So, a significant portion of their cargo was dedicated to peace and friendship. They packed thousands of gifts. We're talking about 12 dozen pocket mirrors, 4,600 sewing needles, and hundreds of rolls of colorful ribbon. They carried brass thimbles, fish hooks, and bright red vermilion face paint. And for the chiefs, they brought special peace medals, minted with President Jefferson's image on one side and symbols of peace on the other. These weren't just trinkets. They were diplomatic tools, gestures of goodwill intended to open doors, build trust, and establish trade relationships. Each gift was a carefully chosen olive branch, a hope that their journey would be one of peaceful passage and mutual respect, not conflict. By the spring of 1804, the pieces were all in place. The training was complete. The supplies were loaded onto a custom-built, 55-foot keelboat and two smaller pirogues. The crew, a hand-picked group of soldiers and frontiersmen, was assembled near St. Louis. The air was thick with anticipation. They were standing on the very edge of their known world, looking west toward a horizon that held both incredible promise and unimaginable peril. Lewis, now joined by his co-captain, William Clark, had transformed from a soldier into a scientist, a doctor, a diplomat, and a leader. The supplies represented the best technology and resources their young nation could offer. The mission, once just a bold idea in Jefferson's mind, was now a tangible reality. A floating outpost of the United States ready to push into the heart of the continent. The journey was no longer a distant dream. It was about to begin. The great unknown was waiting. Thanks for joining us on this leg of the journey. If you're fascinated by this incredible story of preparation and courage, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what happens when they finally cast off and head up to Missouri. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey into the American frontier. This is Chapter 4. The expedition assembles. After months of meticulous planning and anticipation, the spring of 1804 finally arrived, breathing life into the ambitious vision of President Jefferson. The air at Camp de Bois, near St. Louis, was thick with a palpable sense of purpose. This wasn't just another military assignment. It was the dawn of an unprecedented American odyssey. The cause of discovery was about to be born. The call had gone out across the fledgling nation, seeking not just soldiers, but a unique breed of men. They needed individuals who were as comfortable with a rifle as they were with an oar. Men whose spirits were forged in the crucible of the wilderness. Dozens answered, drawn by the promise of adventure, the allure of the unknown, and a deep-seated sense of patriotic duty. Captains Lewis and Clark were faced with the critical task of handpicking the perfect team. This was a process of intense scrutiny. They weren't just looking for physical strength. They needed resilience, discipline, and unwavering character. Each candidate was interviewed, their skills tested, and their temperament judged. Could they endure months of back-breaking labor? Could they face down danger with a steady hand? Could they work together, day in and day out, in the most challenging conditions imaginable? Only the best of the best would make the cut. From this rigorous selection emerged a core group of about 45 souls. It was a diverse and highly skilled assembly, a microcosm of the young, resourceful nation itself. There were the seasoned soldiers, men like Sergeant Charles Floyd and Sergeant John Ordway, whose military discipline would provide the backbone of the expedition. Their experience in command and logistics was invaluable, ensuring order and efficiency in the wild. Alongside them stood the hunters, the true masters of the frontier. Men like George Drouillard, a man of French and Shawnee heritage, were more than just marksmen. They were walking encyclopedias of the wilderness. Drouillard's skills were legendary. He could read the land like a book, track game for miles, and communicate with Native American tribes using a sophisticated system of sign language. He and others like him, such as the Field brothers, Joseph and Reuben, would be responsible for keeping the expedition fed. Their ability to hunt deer, elk, and buffalo would mean the difference between survival and starvation. Then there were the boatmen, the sinewy river experts who would pilot the expedition's vessels against the relentless current of the Missouri. Many were French-Canadian voyageurs, men who had spent their lives navigating the continent's great waterways. Their knowledge of the river's moods, its hidden sandbars, its treacherous snags, its powerful currents, was second to none. They propelled the heavy keelboat and the smaller pirogues forward, inch by painstaking inch, their powerful strokes a constant rhythm against the flow of the mighty river. The group also included skilled blacksmiths and carpenters, like John Shields and William Bratton. Their ability to repair rifles, forge tools, and mend the boats was absolutely essential. In the vast, remote wilderness, there would be no supply depots, no workshops to turn to for help. They had to be completely self-sufficient. A broken rifle or a damaged rudder could spell disaster, and these craftsmen were the expedition's lifeline, ensuring their equipment remained functional. Finally, there were the interpreters. Communication would be key to fulfilling one of the mission's primary objectives, establishing peaceful relations with the dozens of Native American tribes they would encounter. Lewis and Clark understood that their journey was not one of conquest, but of diplomacy and scientific discovery. They needed to bridge the gap of language and culture. The presence of interpreters like Drouillard was a crucial first step in opening a dialogue, trading for supplies, and gathering vital information about the lands that lay ahead. Each man brought a unique and indispensable skill to the table. They were soldiers, hunters, boatmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, and diplomats all rolled into one. They packed their gear, checked their rifles, and sharpened their tools. The keelboat, a 55-foot marvel of practicality, was loaded to the brim with provisions, scientific instruments, weapons, ammunition, and gifts for the native tribes' beads, tools, and medals bearing the president's likeness. As they made their final preparations, a powerful sense of camaraderie began to form. They were a band of brothers, united by a shared mission. Their official orders were clear: to follow the Missouri River to its source, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, if one existed, map the uncharted territory, document new species of plants and animals, and establish American sovereignty. It was a monumental task, filled with promise and fraught with peril. On May 14, 1804, under the command of William Clark, the expedition officially set off from Camp Dubois. The keelboat, with its sail unfurled, and the two pirogues pushed into the powerful current of the Missouri River. Lewis would join them a few days later in St. Charles. After finalizing affairs in St. Louis, the great journey had begun. With every pull of the oar, they left the familiar world behind, venturing into a vast, unknown continent. The expedition was assembled. Their spirits were high, and the pages of American history were waiting to be written. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. If you're enjoying this historical series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to life. We'll see you next time as the Corps of Discovery begins its arduous journey up the mighty Missouri. The winter of 1803 had been long and grueling, a period of intense preparation at Camp Dubois, just across the Mississippi from St. Louis. Here, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark forged a disparate group of soldiers, woodsmen, and voyageurs into a disciplined unity corps of discovery. They spent months drilling, training, and gathering every conceivable supply. From scientific instruments and trade goods for Native American tribes to weapons and provisions, the air was thick with anticipation, a mix of excitement and the quiet, knowing apprehension of the unknown. They were standing on the very edge of the known world, about to step off the map. St. Louis, a bustling frontier outpost, was the last bastion of American civilization they would see for a very long time. It was a melting pot of French, Spanish, and American cultures, a vibrant hub of the fur trade, and the gateway to the vast, uncharted West. The men made their final farewells, wrote letters home, and savored what could be their last taste of familiar comforts. Every day was a countdown to departure, each sunset bringing them one step closer to the journey that would define their lives and change the face of a nation. On May 14, 1804, the day finally dawned. A cool spring breeze rustled the leaves as the Corps of Discovery made their final preparations. The atmosphere was charged. Meriwether Lewis was in St. Louis finalizing some last-minute arrangements, so the honor of leading the initial departure fell to William Clark. With a commanding voice that cut through the morning air, he gave the order to cast off. Oars dipped into the muddy waters of the Missouri River, and the heavy keelboat, accompanied by two smaller pirogues, began its slow, arduous journey upstream. Spectators lined the banks, a mix of townspeople and well-wishers, their cheers and shouts echoing across the water. For the men on board, this was it, the moment of truth. They were leaving everything they knew behind, pushing off into a wilderness that stretched thousands of miles, a land of myth and mystery. Each pull of the oar was a stroke against the powerful current of the Missouri, a fitting metaphor for the immense challenges that lay ahead. This wasn't just a departure, it was the beginning of an American epic. The heart of the expedition was its fleet of 3 vessels, each crucial for the journey. The star of the show was the 55-foot-long keelboat. This was their mothership, a floating fortress and warehouse. It was ingeniously designed, with a shallow draft to navigate the river's sandbars, a sail for when the wind was favorable, and, most importantly, 22 oars for when it wasn't. The boat was packed to the gunwales with supply crates of food, barrels of gunpowder, scientific equipment, and bundles of gifts for the native tribes they would encounter. Lockers lined the sides, providing cover in case of attack, and a small cabin stood at the stern. Accompanying the keelboat were 2 smaller, more nimble boats, called pirogues. One was painted red, the other white. These were essential for scouting ahead, hunting along the riverbanks, and navigating shallower tributaries, where the larger keelboat couldn't go. Together, this small fleet formed the lifeline of the corps, carrying the men and the materials that would sustain them on their monumental trek into the American West. The first few days on the Missouri were a brutal reality check. The river, known affectionately and menacingly as the Big Muddy, was a formidable adversary. Its current was relentless, flowing at about 4 miles per hour, and the men had to fight for every inch of progress. Rowing against it was backbreaking work. When the wind was against them or the river was too winding, the sail was useless. They often had to resort to even more grueling methods. Sometimes they used long poles to push the boat off the riverbed. Other times, they had to engage in cordling, a torturous process where men would walk along the treacherous, often crumbling, riverbanks, hauling the heavy keelboat upstream with a long rope. They battled submerged logs, shifting sandbars that could ground the boat in an instant, and collapsing riverbanks that threatened to swamp them. It was a constant, exhausting struggle against the raw power of nature. These initial days weren't about grand discovery. They were about sheer grit and endurance, setting a tone of perseverance that would define the entire expedition. Life on the river quickly fell into a disciplined, if monotonous, routine. The day began before sunrise with the blast of a horn. After a quick, often spotted breakfast, perhaps some cornmeal mush or leftover game from the previous day's junta, real work began. The men would take to their oars or the cordling rope, their muscles straining against the river's relentless pull. The day was a cycle of sweat, strain, and vigilance. Hunters were sent ashore daily to procure fresh meat, as deer, turkey, and bear were plentiful along the banks. This was crucial, as their preserved rations had to last for the long haul. While most of the men toiled, Clark was constantly at the helm, charting the river's course, taking measurements, and noting geographical features in his journal. Evenings brought a brief respite. They would make camp, post sentinels, repair equipment, and enjoy a hearty meal from the day's hunt. Around the campfire, they would share stories, play music on the fiddle, and find a moment of camaraderie before collapsing into an exhausted sleep, ready to do it all over again at dawn. Just a week into their journey, on May 21st, the corps reached St. Charles, a small French settlement on the Missouri. This would be their last stop in civilization. The town's 450 residents greeted them with overwhelming hospitality, hosting dances and dinners in their honor. For the men, it was a final, joyous celebration before plunging into the true wilderness. They spent several days here, waiting for Louis to arrive from St. Louis with final dispatches and supplies. The festivities were a welcome break, but also a poignant farewell. On May 25th, Louis finally caught up with the expedition. With their commander now present and all preparations complete, the true, uninterrupted journey could begin. The following day, with the entire corps assembled, they pushed off from St. Charles. As the last vestiges of the settlement faded from view, a profound sense of finality must have settled over the men. From this point forward, there was no turning back. They were completely on their own, heading into a vast, unknown continent. Beyond each bend of the Missouri lay a new world, a landscape teeming with life that was utterly alien to them. The Great Plains unfolded in a seemingly endless expanse of tall grass prairie. The sheer abundance of wildlife was staggering, almost beyond belief. They saw vast herds of deer and, for the first time, encountered animals that were previously just legends or rumors back east. They documented strange new creatures like the pronghorn, which they initially described as a type of goat, and were amazed by its incredible speed. They encountered coyotes, which they called prairie wolves, and saw the vast, sprawling towns of prairie dogs that stretched 4 miles. The journals of Lewis and Clark began to fill with detailed sketches and descriptions of new flora and fauna, a testament to the scientific purpose of their mission. Every day brought a fresh sense of wonder and discovery. They weren't just traveling through this land. They were its first scientific observers, cataloging a world that no American had ever seen before. The journey was transforming from a struggle against a river into a voyage of incredible discovery. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the expedition was constantly on alert. They were traveling through territory that was home to numerous Native American tribes, including the Osage, the Kansa, and the powerful Sioux. While their mission was one of peaceful exploration and diplomacy, the potential for conflict was always present. The Corps was, after all, a military unit. Sentinels were posted every night, and the men kept their rifles cleaned and ready. They were a well-armed party, and their keelboat, with its swivel cannons and fortified sides, was a formidable presence on the river. However, their primary goal was to establish friendly relations. Lewis and Clark carried peace medals in various sizes, American flags, and a trove of gifts. They were instructed by President Jefferson to announce American sovereignty over the land, but to do so as friends and partners in trade. The first few weeks were quiet on this front, as they passed through lands that were largely depopulated or where tribes were away on summer hunts. But the anticipation of that first crucial encounter hung in the air, a key test of their diplomatic skills that they knew was just around the next river bend. Looking back, these first few weeks on the Missouri River were more than just the start of a journey. They were a crucible that forged the Corps of Discovery into the resilient, unified team they needed to be. The relentless physical labor of moving the boats upstream built not only muscle, but also a shared sense of purpose and interdependence. The men learned to rely on each other completely. The strict military discipline instilled by Lewis and Clark provided the structure necessary to survive, while the daily discoveries of new landscapes and wildlife fueled their sense of adventure and wonder. They were leaving the familiar world behind and, in the process, discovering new things not only about the land, but also about themselves and their own limits of endurance. The sail from St. Louis was the opening chapter of their epic, a testament to human determination in the face of an immense and indifferent wilderness. The unknown lands that awaited them beyond each bend were not just a challenge to be overcome, but a promise of a legacy that would echo through American history. Thank you so much for joining us on this leg of the journey. The story of Lewis and Clark is just getting started, with so many more challenges, discoveries, and pivotal moments to come. If you enjoyed this chapter, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts. Your support makes these historical deep dives possible. We'll see you next time as the course pushes further into the great unknown. The expedition was now face to face with its greatest challenge and its greatest hope, the Missouri River. This vast, muddy artery pulsed through the heart of the continent, a muscular, untamed force of nature. They called it the Mighty Mo, and it was a name earned through its sheer, indomitable power. For the Corps of Discovery, this river was everything. It was their highway west, the liquid road they believed would carry them toward the Pacific. But it was also a relentless adversary, a formidable obstacle that would test the limits of their strength, their ingenuity, and their will to survive. Every single day began before the sun, with the groans of men straining against the current. The keelboat, a 55-foot vessel laden with tons of supplies, was a beast to manage. When the wind was in their favor, they could raise the sail and feel a moment of grace, a brief illusion of ease as they skimmed over the water. But such days were rare gifts. More often than not, the wind was against them, or there was no wind at all. On those days, the real work began. The men would take to the oars, their backs bending and muscles screaming in a rhythmic, grueling ballet. They'd row for hours on end, sweat stinging their eyes, their hands blistering and callousing, each stroke a small victory against the river's unyielding push. But rowing wasn't always an option. The Missouri was a serpent, constantly twisting and turning, its channel shallow and unpredictable. Sandbars, like hidden teeth, lay just beneath the surface, ready to snag the keelboat and hold it fast. When the boat ran aground, the men would leap into the cold, murky water, sometimes up to their shoulders, their feet sinking into the sucking mud. They would put their backs against the hull and push, heave, and strain, fighting with all their might to free the vessel from the river's grip. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing work, often lasting for hours under the oppressive glare of the sun. The river seemed to delight in these little traps, a constant reminder of who was truly in charge. When the channel was too swift or too shallow for oars, another method of torture was employed. The tow rope, a line sometimes hundreds of feet long, would be tied to the mast of the keelboat. The men would then scramble ashore, stumbling over rocks, thorns, and tangled undergrowth. They'd sling the heavy rope over their shoulders and begin to walk, pulling the massive boat against the current, inch by painstaking inch. This was called cordelling, and it was the most brutal work of all. They were human mules, their bodies straining against the immense weight of the boat and the relentless force of the water. The riverbanks would often crumble beneath their feet, sending them tumbling into the water. They'd climb out, soaked and muddy, and start pulling again. Their moccasins wore out. Their clothes were shredded, but they kept going, their eyes fixed on the next bend in the river. And then there was the heat. As spring turned to summer, the plains of the Midwest became a furnace. The sun beat down without mercy, reflecting off the water's surface and creating a blinding, shimmering haze. There was no shade, no escape. The air was thick and heavy, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. Dehydration was a constant threat, and the men drank heavily from the river, the silty water gritty in their throats. But the heat was just one part of their torment. With the heat came the insects. Clouds of mosquitoes, so thick they looked like a black fog, rose from the wetlands along the river. They were voracious, relentless. The men's hands, faces, and any exposed patch of skin were covered in painful itching welts. At night, sleep was nearly impossible. The buzzing was a constant, maddening drone in their ears. They tried smearing their skin with bear grease and beaver oil, a foul-smelling concoction that offered only minimal protection. Lewis wrote in his journal of the very troublesome mosquitoes, a classic understatement for the sheer misery they inflicted. Alongside the mosquitoes were biting flies, gnats, and ticks that burrowed into their skin, each adding its own special brand of irritation. The physical toll was immense. The men were constantly exhausted, their bodies aching from a dozen different kinds of labor. They were plagued by boils, dysentery from the river water, and injuries from slipping on rocks or wrestling with equipment. Yet, their spirits, for the most part, held firm. They were a team, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship. In the evenings, after a meager meal of whatever game had been shot that day, they would gather around the campfire. The fiddles would come out, and the sound of music would drift across the water, a defiant cry of humanity against the vast, indifferent wilderness. They would sing, tell stories, and laugh, finding solace and strength in each other's company. This journey up the Missouri was a crucible. It was stripping away their softness, hardening their bodies, and sharpening their senses. They were learning the river's moods, its rhythms, and its dangers. They were becoming as tough and resilient as the landscape itself. Every bend in the river brought a new vista, a new landscape of breathtaking beauty. They saw vast herds of bison that stretched to the horizon, graceful pronghorn antelope, and enormous grizzly bears that commanded respect and fear. The land was rich, vibrant, and teeming with life. It was a world that no American had ever seen before, and they were the first to witness its wonders. But the river remained the central character in their daily drama. It was a great provider, offering fish for their nets and a path for their boats. It was the great teacher, instructing them in the virtues of patience, perseverance, and humility. And it was the great adversary, the monster they had to battle every single day. They were not conquering the Missouri. They were learning to coexist with it, to navigate its power with a combination of brute force and clever adaptation. As they pushed deeper into the unknown, every mile gained was a testament to their incredible endurance. The mighty Missouri was doing more than just carrying them west. It was transforming them, forging them into the legendary explorers they were destined to become. Thank you so much for joining us on this part of the journey. The challenges are only just beginning. If you're captivated by this incredible story of exploration and survival, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do wouldn't miss the next chapter. We appreciate your support more than you know. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7, Encounters with Native Nations. As Lewis and Clark pushed deeper into the uncharted American West, their greatest challenges and most profound lessons came not from the harsh wilderness, but from the diverse peoples who called this land home. This chapter is all about diplomacy, cultural exchange, and the delicate dance of first contact. Up until this point, the Corps of Discovery had primarily traveled through lands abandoned due to recent smallpox epidemics. The silence was eerie, a haunting reminder of the unseen forces reshaping the continent. But as they journeyed up the Missouri River, that was about to change dramatically. Their first significant meeting was with the Oto and Missouri tribes. Imagine the scene. A group of weary American explorers, far from anything they knew, setting up camp. Suddenly, they see representatives from these powerful nations approaching. There's tension, but also immense curiosity on both sides. This wasn't just a simple hello. This was a formal council, a meeting of sovereign powers on the plains. Lewis and Clark, acting as emissaries of President Thomas Jefferson, unfurled their flags and presented official peace medals. These medals, bearing Jefferson's image on one side and symbols of peace on the other, were meant to signify a new alliance, a new relationship between the United States and the tribes of the West. For the OTO in Missouri, this was a crucial moment. They were navigating their own complex political landscape, often caught between more powerful neighbors like the Sioux. An alliance with this new, distant power, the Great Father in Washington, as Jefferson was called, offered them protection and valuable trade goods. They listened intently to the American speeches, translated through a chain of languages, absorbing promises of peace and commerce. It was a formal, ritualized affair, full of speeches, gift-giving, and demonstrations of military prowess. Lewis and Clark would fire their air rifle, a marvel of technology that shot multiple rounds without smoke or a loud bang, amazing the onlookers and subtly demonstrating American power. This first council set the template for many that would follow. The explorers learned that success wasn't just about mapping rivers or identifying new species. It was about understanding people. They had to quickly become diplomats, learning the intricate social rules and expectations of each nation they met. Every gesture, every gift, every word carried immense weight. A misstep could lead to mistrust, while a successful council could ensure safe passage and vital supplies. However, not all encounters were as straightforward. As the expedition continued north, they entered the domain of the powerful Lakota Sioux, also known as the Teton Sioux. The Sioux were the undisputed masters of this stretch of the Missouri. They controlled the flow of trade, and they were not easily impressed by the Americans' medals or speeches. When the Corps of Discovery arrived, the atmosphere was immediately more tense. The Sioux saw the Americans, not necessarily as allies, but as potential rivals who might disrupt their control over the river and their trade networks with other tribes. The encounter with the Teton Sioux is one of the most dramatic moments of the entire expedition. It nearly ended in bloodshed. After a council that was filled with misunderstanding and veiled threats, a group of Sioux warriors tried to prevent the Americans from returning to their boats, demanding more gifts, essentially a toll for passage through their territory. Swords were drawn, guns were raised, and for a heart-stopping moment, the entire expedition hung in the balance. It was only through the calm intervention of a chief named Black Buffalo that violence was averted. This confrontation was a stark lesson for Lewis and Clark. They realized that their standard diplomatic script wouldn't work with everyone. The Sioux were not a small, vulnerable tribe seeking protection. They were a proud, powerful nation, asserting their sovereignty. The explorers had stumbled into a complex world of intertribal politics they barely understood. Their mission to establish American influence was met with a firm reminder that they were guests, and not always welcome ones in someone else's homeland. These early encounters fundamentally shaped the rest of the journey. The Corps of Discovery learned that the West was not an empty wilderness, but a crowded continent, filled with people who had their own histories, their own ambitions, and their own power. They learned that diplomacy was a two-way street. It wasn't just about them delivering a message from Jefferson. It was about listening, observing, and adapting. They had to learn which tribes were friendly, which were rivals, and how to navigate the intricate web of alliances and enmities that defined life on the plains. The journals from this period are filled with fascinating details about the customs, clothing, food, and social structures of the Oto, Missouri, and Sioux. The explorers were also ethnographies, meticulously documenting everything they saw. They described the earth lodges of the farming tribes and the buffalo hide tipis of the nomadic Sioux. They recorded vocabularies, drew maps of villages, and described ceremonies they were invited to witness. These records, while filtered through the lens of their own culture, provide an invaluable, if incomplete, snapshot of these societies. At a pivotal moment, in their history, just before their world would be irrevocably changed by westward expansion. The journey up the Missouri was becoming a journey into the heart of human complexity. Lewis and Clark were learning that to navigate the physical landscape, they first had to navigate the human one. Their encounters with the native nations were a constant test of their patience, their courage, and their ability to see the world from another's perspective. The lessons learned in the late summer and early fall of 1804 in the councils with the Oto, Missouri, and the near-disastrous standoff with the Sioux would prove essential for their survival and the ultimate success of their monumental expedition. They had come to claim a continent, but were quickly discovering they first had to understand it. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into history. If you found this chapter as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the trail. Let me know in the comments what you think was the most critical diplomatic skill the explorers had to learn. We'll see you next time as the course of discovery presses on. As we left the familiar forested foothills behind, a new world opened up before us. It was a vast unbroken sea of grass stretching to the horizon, a landscape so immense it felt like stepping onto another planet. This was the Great Plains, Chapter 8 of our journey, a chapter that would be written in lightning, fire, and the thundering hooves of buffalo. Our initial R at the sheer scale of it all was intoxicating. The sky was bigger, the sun brighter, and the wind carried a scent of wild sage and distant rain. We felt a sense of boundless freedom, as if we could ride forever without reaching an end. Little did we know, this beautiful expanse held a power that would test our courage, our endurance, and our very definition of respect. The plains weren't just a place to cross. They were a living, breathing entity, and we were about to learn its language the hard way. Our first few days were deceptively calm. We'd set up camp under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall grass. We'd share stories around the campfire, feeling a deep sense of camaraderie, confident in our skills and our gear. We were seasoned travelers, or so we thought. But the plains have a way of humbling even the most experienced. The weather here wasn't like anything we'd encountered before. It didn't just change. It transformed with a sudden, dramatic violence that left no time for preparation. One afternoon, the idyllic blue sky began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, swelling and boiling with an unnerving speed. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange, metallic tang. The wind, once a gentle companion, began to whip and howl, flattening the grass in waves that rolled towards us like an angry tide. Then came the lightning. It wasn't the distant, flickering kind we were used to. This was a celestial onslaught. Blinding white forks of pure energy stabbed the earth all around us, some striking so close we could feel the heat and the ground tremble beneath our feet. The thunder wasn't a rumble. It was an explosive crack, a deafening concussion that shook us to our bones. There was nowhere to hide. We were tiny, exposed figures in a vast, open arena, caught in the crossfire of a heavenly battle. We instinctively dropped to the ground, making ourselves as small as possible, our hearts pounding in our chests with a primal fear. Each flash illuminated the stark, terrified faces of my companions. In that moment, all our modern knowledge and equipment felt useless. We were at the complete mercy of nature's raw, untamable power. The storm was a terrifying spectacle, but it was also magnificent, a visceral reminder of our own smallness in the grand scheme of things. As the storm finally receded, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-soaked earth, we thought the worst was over. We wary Ron-Rond. The lightning had left a parting gift. A single, unlucky strike had found a patch of dry grass a few miles away. At first, it was just a wisp of smoke on the horizon, something we almost dismissed. But the relentless wind fanned the ember into a flame, and the flame into a roaring monster. A prairie fire. It moved with terrifying speed, a rolling wall of orange and black devouring everything in its path. The smoke choked the air, turning the afternoon sun into a dim, red orb. A deep, rumbling roar grew louder, a sound like a freight train that vibrated through the soles of our boots. Panic began to set in. We were directly in its path. There was no outrunning it, no river to cross, no high ground to escape to. Our survival instincts took over. We remembered old tales from plainsmen and pioneers. Fight fire. With desperate urgency, we began setting a controlled burn of our own. We lit a line of grass downwind from our position, creating a black line, a barren strip of scorched earth that the main fire hopefully wouldn't cross. We worked frantically, our faces streaked with soot, our eyes burning from the smoke. The heat was immense, even from our small fire. We stomped and beat at the edges of our burn, trying to control its spread, creating a safe zone in the middle of our blackened island. It was a desperate gamble. As the main inferno approached, the heat became unbearable, the air thick with flying embers. We huddled together in our fire break, covering our faces with damp clothes, listening to the apocalyptic roar as the wall of flames split and surged around our small sanctuary. It felt like standing in the heart of a furnace. Time seemed to stop. All we could do was wait and pray that our desperate plan would hold. When the main fire front had passed, leaving a smoldering, blackened landscape in its wake, we were left breathless and shaken, but alive. The world was an eerie, monochromatic scene of black and gray, the air still thick with the acrid smell of smoke. The danger, however, was far from over. The fire had spooked the true kings of the plains. We heard it before. We saw Ida low, guttural rumbling that grew steadily into a thunderous tremor that shook the very ground. Over our eyes, a dark, moving mass appeared, a living river of fur and horns, a buffalo stampede. Thousands of them, panicked by the fire, were thundering directly towards us. There was no time to think, only to react. Our scorched patch of ground offered no protection from this. This was a force of nature driven by pure, unthinking terror. The ground vibrated with an intensity that felt like an earthquake. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of pounding hooves and panicked bellows. We were frozen for a second, mesmerized by the terrifying spectacle of 1,000 tons of muscle and bone bearing down on us. Then, adrenaline surged. Scatter. Someone yelled, and we ran, not in a straight line, but fanning out, trying to make ourselves less of a single solid of stately. The lead animals were almost upon us, their eyes wide with fear, their hot breath misting in the smoky air. I dove behind a small, rocky outcropper, only solid thing in 100-yard radius, and pressed myself flat against the ground, making myself as small as humanly possible. The herd split around the rock, a torrent of powerful bodies flowing just feet from where I lay. I could feel the wind from their passing, smell their musky scent, and feel the vibrations rattling my teeth. It was a sensory overload of pure, primal power. I closed my eyes and held my breath, waiting for the inevitable crushing weight. The stampede lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. The thunder of hooves slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind an unnerving silence and a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a ghostly shroud. Cautiously, I peeked out from behind my rock. The plains were empty again, save for the trampled grass and the distant, retreating cloud of dust. One by one, my teammates emerged from their own hiding spots, all of us covered in dirt, wide-eyed and trembling. We did a quick head count, our voices shaky. Miraculously, everyone was accounted for, unharmed. We gathered in a small, tight circle, not saying a word, just looking at each other. The shared experience creating an unspoken bond of profound relief and awe. We had faced the trinity of the plains' fury storm, fire, and stampede, and somehow we had survived. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the scarred and blackened landscape, a profound change settled over us. The plains were no longer just a beautiful, empty space. We had felt their pulse, their power, their unforgiving and impartial might. We weren't conquerors crossing a continent. We were the guests, small and fragile, permitted to pass only by the grace of the land itself. We looked out at the vast, now tranquil expanse with new eyes. We saw not emptiness, but a place of incredible power and resilience, a world with its own ancient rhythms and rules. That evening, around our small, humble campfire on the scorched earth, there was no boasting, no triumphant laughter. There was only a quiet, deep-seated respect. Respect for the lightning that could shatter the sky, for the fire that could cleanse the earth, and for the great herds that were the lifeblood of this land. We had come to the Great Plains seeking adventure, and we had found it. But we left with something far more valuable. A humility and a profound reverence for the wild, untamable heart of the world. Our journey was far from over, but we were no longer the same people who had arrived. We were now people who understood the language of the plains. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense part of our journey. It's your support that keeps us going through trials like these. If you felt that adrenaline rush with us, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Ring that notification bell, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Stay safe and stay adventurous. Welcome back to our journey. Last we left our intrepid explorers. They were pushing deeper into the vast, unknown American West. Now, as autumn leaves begin to fall and a biting chill fills the air, they face their most formidable adversary yet. A brutal northern winter. Their very survival hangs in the balance. This is the story of Fort Mandan. The year is 1804. The expedition has traveled over 1,600 miles, but the Missouri River, their liquid highway, is beginning to freeze over. Ice flows, thick as dinner plates, clog the waterway, making passage impossible. They need a safe harbor, a place to wait out the long, dark months ahead. Their location, near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, in what we now know as North Dakota. Choosing a spot on the north bank of the Missouri, the men set to work with a desperate urgency. Every swing of an axe, every thud of a hammer echoed their race against the encroaching winter. They were building more than just a shelter. They were building a lifeline. Day after day, they felled cottonwood trees, shaping the logs into sturdy walls. The design was a classic frontier fort, a triangular stockade with 2 rows of huts forming 2 sides, and a formidable 18-foot-high palisade completing the triangle. This wasn't just about keeping the cold out. It was about creating a defensible space in a land where they were still strangers. They named it Fort Mandan, in honor of the friendly local tribes who watched their progress with a mixture of curiosity and welcome. Life inside the fort quickly fell into a disciplined rhythm. It had to. With temperatures plummeting to 45 degrees below zero and blizzards raging outside, routine was a shield against both the frost and the monotony. Daily duties were assigned with military precision. Sentries stood guard, their breath turning to ice crystals in the frigid air. Hunting parties ventured out, braving the elements to track bison, deer, and elk. Their success meaning the difference between a full belly and starvation. Others were tasked with chopping firewood, a relentless, back-breaking chore essential for warmth and cooking. Inside the cramped, smoky huts, men mended clothes, repaired equipment, and melted animal fat to make candles, pushing back against the long winter nights. It was a test of endurance, a daily battle of will against the relentless cold. But this winter was not just a story of survival. It was a time of crucial cultural exchange. Their neighbors, the Mandan and Hidatsa people, were not distant figures on the horizon. They were frequent and welcome visitors to the fort. A steady stream of trade and conversation flowed between the 2 groups. The expedition offered metal tools, beads, and other goods in exchange for corn, squash, and beans, a vital supplement to the hunter's game. More importantly, they exchanged knowledge. The captains meticulously recorded details about the Mandan and Hidatsa way of life. Their social structures, their beliefs, their understanding of the land. The native people, in turn, were fascinated by the explorers' technology, their air gun, their compass, their blacksmith's forge. The forge, in particular, was a center of constant activity and wonder. The blacksmith, John Shields, became a local celebrity, repairing the tribe's metal tools and crafting new items. His hammer strikes a symbol of a powerful, new kind of magic. This wasn't a one-sided relationship. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and necessity. The Mandan leaders shared invaluable information about the geography that lay ahead, drawing maps in the dirt or on animal hides, describing the great falls and the towering mountains that awaited the expedition in the spring. It was during this period of intense interaction that a figure of immense historical importance entered the story. A French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau had been living among the Hidatsa. He offered his services to the expedition as an interpreter, but it was his wife who would truly change the course of their journey. Her name was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman. She had been captured by the Hadetsa in a raid years earlier and was now one of Charbonneau's wives. Sacagawea was only about 16 years old, and she was pregnant. Initially, the captains may have seen her as just part of the package deal for hiring her husband, but they soon realized her true value. She spoke Shoshone, a language no one else in the expedition knew. This was critical, because the captains knew that to cross the Rocky Mountains, they would need horses, and the people who had horses were the Shoshone, Sacagawea's own people. She was their key to the West, but she was more than just a potential interpreter. Her very presence was a powerful symbol. In the cultures of the plains, a war party never traveled with a woman and a child. Sacagawea's presence signaled to every native group they would encounter that this was a mission of peace, not conquest. She was a walking, talking white flag, an emblem of peaceful intentions that no speech or gift could ever match. As the winter deepened, Sacagawea's quiet strength and resilience became more and more apparent. On February 11th, 1805, inside the cold, rough walls of Fort Mandan, she gave birth to a baby boy, Jean-Baptiste Carbona. The captains assisted with the difficult delivery, solidifying a bond of care and trust. This tiny baby, nicknamed Pomp or Pompey by Captain Clark, became the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery. His presence further softened the expedition's image, a gurgling, cooing testament to their peaceful mission. So, the winter at Fort Mandan was a transformative period. It was a crucible that tested the men's physical and mental fortitude. It was a classroom where they learned invaluable lessons about the land and its people from there. Mandan and Hadata, neighbors, and it was the place where they met Sacagawea, the young woman who would guide them not just across the mountains, but through the complex cultural landscapes of the West. As the ice on the Missouri River began to groan and crack under the first warmth of spring, the expedition was ready. They were rested, resupplied, and armed with new knowledge. Most importantly, they were now joined by a woman and her newborn son, whose destiny was now interwoven with their own. The journey ahead was still fraught with peril, but thanks to the winter at Fort Mandan, they were better prepared than ever to face it. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter of this story. If you're enjoying this epic journey, please do forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next video as the expedition heads toward the great unknown. Imagine trekking across an unknown continent, facing harsh winters, unpredictable rivers, and the constant threat of the unknown. Now, add a newborn baby to the mix. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly what happened on the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition. Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into one of the most remarkable and humanizing chapters of this incredible journey. The birth of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. As the winter of 1804 bled into 1805, the Corps of Discovery was hunkered down at Fort Mandan, in what is now North Dakota. The snow was deep, the winds were fierce, and the temperature regularly plunged far below freezing. For months, they had been guests of the Mandan and Hadetsa peoples, repairing equipment, gathering intelligence for the journey ahead, and simply trying to survive the brutal northern plains winter. Among the expedition members was a young, pregnant Shoshone woman named Sac, and her husband, the French-Canadian trader, Toussaint Charbonneau. The captains, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, had hired Charbonneau as an interpreter, but it was Sacagawea they truly needed. She spoke Shoshone, a language crucial for their upcoming passage through the Rocky Mountains, where they would need to acquire horses from her people to continue their journey. But as winter dragged on, it became clear their new guide would be bringing along a +1. On February 11th, 1805, inside the smoky, cramped quarters of Fort Mandan, Sacagawea went into labor. By all accounts, it was a difficult and prolonged birth. Lewis, who had some medical training, grew concerned. He recorded in his journal that her labor was tedious and the pain violent. A French trader suggested a folk remedy: a small amount of crushed rattlesnake rattle mixed with water. Desperate to ease her suffering, Lewis administered the mixture. Whether by coincidence or actual effect, he wrote that she gave birth to a healthy baby boy just 10 minutes later. They named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. But he would soon earn a nickname from Captain Clark that would stick with him for life. Pomp, or Pompey, a Shoshone word for firstborn son. From that moment on, the Corps of Discovery, this rugged band of soldiers and explorers, had its youngest member. A tiny baby, bundled against the freezing cold, was now part of an epic quest across a continent. Think about the sheer audacity of this. The expedition was already a high-stakes gamble. They were venturing into territories completely uncharted by Americans, with no guarantee of survival. The plan was to travel thousands of miles by river and on foot, through mountains and wilderness. And now, they had a newborn infant in their care. It's a detail that often gets overlooked, but it's arguably one of the most astounding aspects of the entire story. The presence of a baby fundamentally changed the dynamic of the expedition. In the eyes of the Native American tribes they would soon encounter, the group looked less like a war party and more like a peaceful, traveling community. A war party would never bring a woman and a child. This inadvertently became one of their greatest diplomatic assets. Sacagawea, carrying Pomp on her back in a cradleboard, became a universal symbol of peace. Her presence disarmed suspicion and opened doors for trade and communication that might have otherwise remained firmly shut. When the ice on the Missouri River finally broke in April 1805, the expedition set off once more. The real journey west was about to begin. As their pirogues and keelboat pushed against the current, little Jean-Baptiste was there, swaddled tightly, experiencing the grand American West from his mother's back. He would endure everything the grown men did. Mosquito swarms, sudden storms, grizzly bear encounters, and dwindling food supplies. There's a particularly harrowing story that highlights just how precarious their situation was. One day, a sudden squall hit their boat. Charbonneau, who was at the helm, panicked and nearly capsized the vessel. All their precious cargo journals, instruments, medicine, and supplies was about to be lost to the river. While the other men struggled to regain control, it was Sacagawea who, with Pomp strapped to her back, calmly and methodically reached into the churning water to rescue the floating bundles. She saved the priceless records of the expedition from certain destruction, all while ensuring the safety of her infant son. Captain Clark, in particular, developed a deep affection for the boy. He doted on my little dancing boy Pompey, and his journals are filled with fond references to him. This bond would last a lifetime. As the expedition neared its end, Clark was so taken with the bright, resilient child that he made a remarkable offer to Sacagawea and Charbonneau. He offered to raise Jean-Baptiste as his own son, to give him an education and a life back in St. Louis. Imagine the weight of that decision for Sacagawea. She had journeyed thousands of miles, reunited with her long-lost brother, and proven herself an indispensable member of the Corps. Now, her son, who had been a constant companion through every trial, had the opportunity for a future she could never provide. After returning to the Mandan villages, they eventually took Clark up on his offer. A few years later, the family traveled to St. Louis, where Jean-Baptiste was formally placed under William Clark's guardianship. And what a life he led. Thanks to Clark's patronage, Pomp received an excellent education. He learned multiple languages and, as a young man, traveled to Europe for 6 years with a German prince he had met on the frontier. He lived a life of adventure that rivaled even his parents, working as a mountain man, a guide, a gold miner in California, and even the mayor of a community. The baby, born in a remote fort, who crossed a continent before he could walk, grew up to be a truly remarkable figure of the American West. The story of Jean-Baptiste's birth is more than just a quaint anecdote. It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and especially to the incredible strength of his mother. It adds a layer of profound humanity to the Lewis and Clark saga. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a journey of people, of families, and of new life in the face of overwhelming odds. The tiny baby in the cradleboard reminds us that history is not just about grand strategies and famous names. It's about the personal, intimate moments that define our shared human experience. The expedition wasn't just exploring a new land. It was carrying the future with it, one bumpy, uncertain, and miraculous step at a time. Thank you so much for joining me today for this chapter of the story. It's a personal favorite of mine, and I hope you found it as moving as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. We've got a lot more ground to cover on this incredible journey. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on Lewis and Clark. We're now at Chapter 11, Journey into the Unknown. As the ice on the Missouri River finally broke in the spring of 1805, a palpable sense of anticipation filled the air at Fort Mandan. The long, harsh winter was over. For the men of the Corps of Discovery, this wasn't just the start of a new season. It was the start of the real expedition. Everything up to this point, the journey from St. Louis, the winter among the Mandan and Hatat had been a prelude. Now, they were about to step off the map. On April 7, 1805, the expedition split. A small crew boarded the keelboat, laden with journals, maps, and natural specimens, to begin the long journey back to St. Louis. Their mission was to deliver the first report of the expedition's findings to President Jefferson. For them, the adventure was winding down. But for Lewis, Clark, and the rest of the permanent party, the true journey into the unknown was just beginning. They watched the keelboat disappear downriver, then turned their faces west, towards a continent that, for them, was a complete mystery. Their fleet now consisted of 2 large pirogues and 6 smaller canoes. As they pushed off from the bank, they were a smaller, more agile unit, ready to face the challenges of the upper Missouri. The mood was one of nervous excitement. They were heading into territory no white man had ever officially explored or mapped. The maps they had were based on speculation and indigenous accounts, full of blank spaces and question marks. Every bend in the river would reveal something new, something no one in their world had ever seen before. Among the party was a new and vital member, Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman, with her husband Toussaint Charbonneau and their infant son, Jean Baptiste, affectionately nicknamed Pomp by Captain Clark. While Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, it was Sacagawea who would prove indispensable. Her knowledge of the land, its edible plants, and the complex network of tribal relations they were about to navigate was more valuable than any map. She was their guide, their diplomat, and a symbol of peace. A war party, the logic went, would not travel with a woman and a baby. Her presence was a silent, powerful message of their peaceful intentions. The initial days were returned to the familiar rhythm of river travel. The men rowed, poled, and sometimes towed the boats against the relentless current of the Missouri. The landscape, however, began to change dramatically. The rolling plains gave way to more rugged terrain. They marveled at the sheer abundance of wildlife. Vast herds of bison, so numerous they seemed to cover the plains like a shaggy carpet, roamed freely. Elk, deer, and antelope were constant sights. But with this abundance came new dangers. The grizzly bear, a creature they had only heard tales about, soon became a terrifying reality. These bears were larger, stronger, and far more aggressive than the black bears they knew back east. The first encounters were shocking. Lewis wrote of a grizzly that, after being shot multiple times, chased its attackers for 100 yards before finally succumbing to its wounds. These were not animals to be trifled with. They were the undisputed kings of this wilderness, and the men quickly learned to treat them with a mixture of awe and profound respect. As they pushed deeper into what is now Montana, Sacagawea's value became increasingly apparent. She pointed out familiar landmarks from her childhood, reassuring the captains that they were on the right path towards the headwaters of the Missouri and her Shoshone people. When a sudden squall nearly capsized one of the pirogues, threatening to spill precious instruments, journals, and medicines into the river, it was Sacagawea who calmly and quickly reached into the churning water to rescue the floating bundles, while the panicked boatmen struggled to regain control. Her clear-headedness saved a priceless portion of the expedition's records. Clark noted in his journal that she was more composed than anyone on the boat. They passed the mouth of a large tributary, which they named the Yellowstone River. Here, the land became even more alien and spectacular. They were entering the white cliffs of the Missouri, a breathtaking stretch of sandstone formations carved by wind and water into fantastical shapes. Lewis, a man of letters, was moved to poetic descriptions in his journal, comparing the cliffs to the ruins of an ancient, grand city. He wrote of lofty front, running in every direction, imagining elegant ranges of lofty freestone buildings and the most sublime and extraordinary appearances. For the men, it was like paddling through a dreamscape, a world untouched by human hands, wild and magnificent. But this beauty was underscored by constant hardship. The river's current grew stronger. The men were often in the frigid water for hours, pulling the heavy boats over shallow sandbars and rocks, their feet cut and bruised. Mosquitoes descended in thick, maddening clouds. The daily grind was immense, a test of physical and mental endurance. Yet, their spirits remained high, fueled by the thrill of discovery and the leadership of their captains. In late May, they faced a critical decision. They arrived at a major fork in the river. One branch flowed from the north, the other from the south. Their indigenous informants had not mentioned this fork. Which way was the true Missouri? Which path led to the great falls they had been told about, the landmark that would signal they were nearing the Rocky Mountains? Choosing the wrong path could mean losing weeks, even months, of precious time, potentially trapping them in the mountains for the winter. The captains halted the expedition. This was a puzzle that had to be solved. Most of the men believed the northern fork was the main channel. It was wider and muddier, just like the Missouri they knew. But Lewis and Clark were skeptical. The southern fork ran clearer and swifter, characteristic of a mountain river. They decided to split up and explore both forks on foot. After several days of reconnaissance, their hunch was confirmed. The South Fork was the correct route. Lewis, leading a small party ahead, was the first to hear a distant rumble. Epu said on, and on June 13th, 1805, he stood in awe, looking at the great falls of the Missouri, a series of massive waterfalls, cascading through a deep canyon. He had found it. T-sight was the grandest object which I had ever beheld, he wrote, but his awe was mixed with a daunting realization. There was no way to take the boats through this. They would have to portage carry everything, boats included, around the falls. The short portage they had been told about turned out to be an excruciating 80-mile trek over rough, cactus-covered terrain under the scorching sun, and plagued by rattlesnakes and grizzly bears. This portage would become one of the most grueling challenges of the entire expedition. It took them nearly a month. They built crude wagons to haul the heavy canoes and supplies, the wheels collapsing under the strain. The men suffered from exhaustion, injuries, and relentless hailstorms. Yet, they persevered. Their determination and teamwork were unbreakable. By mid-July, they were back on the river, past the falls, and paddling towards the mountains that loomed on the horizon. They had journeyed into the unknown and conquered every obstacle. They had left the familiar world behind and were now on the doorstep of the Great Rocky Mountains. The next challenge was to find Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone, from whom they desperately needed to acquire horses to cross the Continental Divide before winter set in once again. The clock was ticking, and the hardest part of their journey was still to come. Thank you so much for joining us on this part of the journey. If you're enjoying this historical adventure, please give this video a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you then. Las 0:15. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of Lewis and Clark. Today, we arrive at a landmark that would test the cores of discovery like never before. The Great Falls of the Missouri River. This wasn't just a single waterfall. It was a series of 5 colossal cascades, a thunderous spectacle of nature's power. 0:15 to 0:30 in his journal. Meriwether Lewis was utterly captivated. He tried to capture the scene in words, describing it as the grandest sight he had ever beheld. The sheer volume of water, the deafening roar, the mist that rose like smoke, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated awe for the explorers. 0:30 to 1 o'clock. They had been searching for this landmark for weeks, following the advice of the Hidatsa people. Finding the falls was a moment of triumph. It confirmed they were on the right path, heading toward the headwaters of the Missouri. But as the initial awe subsided, a daunting reality set in. There was no way to navigate these falls by water. Their path forward was blocked by an 80-mile stretch of unforgiving terrain. 1 o'clock to 1:30, the only option was a portage carrying everything they had overland. Not just their supplies, but the heavy dugout canoes themselves. This wasn't a casual stroll. The ground was a brutal mix of rocky soil and sharp prickly pear cactus that tore through their moccasins and feet. It was a landscape that seemed actively hostile to their presence. 1:30 to 2 o'clock, their plan was to build crude wagons to haul the canoes. They felled cottonwood trees, crafting rough-hewn wheels and axles. But the green, unseasoned wood was no match for the terrain. Axles snapped, wheels broke, and progress was agonizingly slow. Each step was a battle against the land itself. 2 o'clock to 2:30, imagine the scene. Men, exhausted and sore, straining to pull and push these massive canoes over hills and through ravines under the scorching summer sun. Their moccasins were shredded, their feet bloody from the relentless cactus spines. It was a test of raw physical endurance. 2:30 to 3 o'clock. And it wasn't just the terrain. The weather turned against them with a vengeance. Sudden, violent hailstorms would erupt without warning, pelting them with ice stones, big enough to knock a man down. Flash floods tore through the coulees, threatening to sweep away their precious supplies and equipment. 3 o'clock to 3:31, particularly harrowing incident involved Captain Clark, Sacagawea, her baby Jean-Baptiste, and York. They took shelter in a ravine from an approaching storm, but it quickly became a death. A wall of water rushed down the gulch, and Clark, with incredible presence of mind, scrambled up the steep, muddy banks, pulling Sacagawea and her baby to safety just moments before the torrent washed away everything they had left behind. 3:30 to 4 o'clock, it was a near-fatal reminder of how quickly their fortunes could change. Their rifles, compasses, and vital notes were all lost in the flood. The very tools they relied on for survival were gone in an instant, highlighting the constant, unpredictable danger of their environment. 4 o'clock to 4:30, amidst all this hardship, the wildlife was both a wonder and a threat. Massive herds of buffalo, thousands strong, roamed the plains, but there were also the grizzly bears, which seemed more numerous and aggressive here than anywhere else on their journey. The men had to stay constantly vigilant, never knowing when a bear might charge from a thicket. 4:30 to 5 o'clock. The physical toll was immense. Men suffered from exhaustion, injuries, and sunstroke. But the psychological strain was just as severe. The constant struggle, the feeling of making almost no progress for so much effort, began to wear on their morale. This was the point where the expedition could have easily fractured. 5 o'clock to 5:30 yet. It was also where their unity shone brightest. They leaned on each other, shared the burdens, and refused to give up. When one man faltered, others stepped in. They repaired the broken wagons, tended to each other's wounds, and found the collective strength to keep pushing forward, one painful foot at a time. 5:30 to 6 o'clock, this grueling month-long ordeal around the Great Falls became a defining moment for the Corps of Discovery. It wasn't about the glory of discovery, but about the grit of survival. It forged them into a tougher, more resilient unit, bound by the shared memory of overcoming a seemingly impossible obstacle. 6 o'clock to 6:30, after nearly a month of backbreaking labor, they finally completed the 80. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they had made it. They could once again put their canoes back in the Missouri River, leaving the thunder of the falls behind them. They had faced one of their greatest challenges and emerged victorious, not through individual heroism, but through collective perseverance. 6:30 to 7 o'clock. This chapter of their journey is a powerful testament to human resilience. It shows that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in a single, glorious moment, but through the slow, steady, and often painful process of putting one foot in front of the other, day after day. The Great Falls nearly broke them, but instead, it made them stronger. 7 o'clock to 7:30. As they continued upstream, the landscape began to change once more. The plains gave way to towering cliffs, and on July 25th, they reached a landmark that would be named the Gates of the Rocky Mountains. Here, the Missouri River carves a dramatic path through a narrow canyon, with sheer rock walls rising over 1,000 feet on either side. Las 7:30, las 8. Lewis described it as the most remarkable cliffs that we have yet seen. For a stretch of nearly 6 miles, it seemed as if the mountains were parting just long enough to let the river and the expedition pass through. It was a breathtaking gateway, signaling their official entry into the foreboding Rocky Mountains, the next great barrier on their quest to the Pacific. 8 o'clock to 8:30, the men navigated this narrow channel, dwarfed by the immense scale of the canyon walls. It was a moment of transition, leaving the vast, open plains behind and entering a new, more confined and vertical world. The challenges ahead would be different, but no less formidable. They were now truly in the heart of the Rockies. 8:30 to 9 o'clock, finding a navigable path through this labyrinth of stone was now their primary objective. The success of the entire expedition hinged on finding the Shoshone people, Sacagawea's tribe, from whom they desperately needed to acquire horses to cross the mountains before winter set in. The clock was ticking louder than ever. 9 o'clock to 9:30, this crucial next phase of their journey. The search for the Shoshone and the ascent into the Bitterroot Mountains is where the stakes become higher than ever. It is a race against time and a quest for a reunion that will determine the fate of the expedition. 9:30 to 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible story of endurance at the Great Falls. What they accomplished here is truly inspiring. If you're enjoying this historical journey, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you on the trail. Hello everyone and welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of Lewis and Clark. Today, we venture into Chapter 13, Across the Rocky Mountains. This isn't just another leg of the journey. It's the crucible where the Corps of Discovery faced its ultimate test of survival. Imagine standing at the base of a seemingly endless wall of jagged peaks, with winter's icy breath already chasing at your heels. This was the daunting reality for the expedition in the late summer of 1805. After the emotional reunion between Sacagawea and her brother, Chief Kamiawait of the Shoshone, a fragile hope emerged. The Shoshone, though, struggling with their own limited resources, agreed to trade for horses, the expedition's only hope for crossing the formidable Bitterroot Mountains, a range within the Rockies. But the deal was tenuous. The Shoshone were anxious to move to their winter hunting grounds, and time was a luxury the Corps simply didn't have. Every moment of negotiation was a moment closer to being trapped by snow. Lewis and Clark had to secure enough horses not just to carry their men, but also their dwindling supplies and invaluable scientific samples. The tension was palpable. Could they persuade a hungry, nomadic people to part with their most precious asset? With horses finally secured, they began their ascent. The trail they followed, known as the Lolo Trail, was a treacherous, narrow path used by the Nez Perce people. It was a rugged, unforgiving track that snaked its way through dense forests and over steep, rocky ridges. The initial optimism quickly faded as the sheer difficulty of the terrain became apparent. Horses slipped on loose rock, sending precious cargo tumbling down ravines. The men, already weakened by a meager diet, had to constantly dismount and physically haul the animals and their loads up near vertical inclines. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing work from sunrise to sunset. The landscape was brutal, but an even greater enemy was emerging. Starvation. The captains had been assured that game was plentiful along the trail. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The high, dense forests of the Bitterroots were eerily silent. Days went by without a single deer or elk sighting. Their food supply, which was already low, dwindled to almost nothing. They were forced to slaughter some of their colts for food, a decision that pained them, as each horse was critical to their progress. But survival demanded it. The men's rations were reduced to a few mouthfuls of portable soup, a concoction of boiled-down vegetables and seasonings that did little to quell the gnawing hunger in their bellies. Then, the weather turned. An early autumn snowstorm blanketed the mountains, obscuring the already faint trail and plunging temperatures to freezing. Dressed in thin leather and linen, the men were soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Frostbite became a constant threat. Their moccasins, worn thin by the sharp rocks, offered little protection. They were trapped in a frozen, silent wilderness, with every step draining their last reserves of energy. Private Joseph Whitehouse wrote in his journal, "Snow about 10 inches deep. The men are becoming feeble and worn out." You can feel the desperation in his words. This was the moment the expedition truly stared into the abyss. Morale hit an all-time low. For the first time, some men began to quietly question the mission, wondering if they would ever see their homes again. The indomitable spirit of the Corps was cracking under the immense pressure of cold, exhaustion, and relentless hunger. They were lost, starving, and freezing. Captain Clark, ever the pragmatist, recognized the dire situation. The entire expedition was on the verge of collapse. If they didn't find food and a way out of the mountains soon, they would all perish. The dream of reaching the Pacific was turning into a frozen nightmare. Faced with this grim reality, the captains made a desperate gamble. Clark, along with a small advance party of the 6 best hunters, would push ahead as fast as possible. They would travel light and fast, hoping to break out of the mountains, find food, and then send a relief party back for the main group, which was struggling under Lewis's command. It was a race against time. The fate of the entire corps of Discovery now rested on the shoulders of Clark and his 6 men. Could they navigate the treacherous, snow-covered maze and find salvation on the other side before the rest of the expedition succumbed to the elements? Pushing their bodies to the absolute limit, Clark's party descended from the icy peaks onto the plains below, and there they found them, the Nez Perce tribe. Unlike the Shoshone, the Nez Perce were a large, prosperous nation. They were initially wary of these strange, emaciated men who appeared out of the mountains. But guided by an elderly woman who had once been treated kindly by white traders, the Nez Perce chose peace over conflict. They welcomed Clark's party, sharing their ample stores of dried salmon and camas roots. For Clark and his men, it was a miracle. They had found deliverance. After regaining some strength, they immediately organized a rescue mission. The Nez Perce provided fresh horses and food, and the relief party retraced their steps back into the deadly bit. When they finally found Lewis and the main group, the men were on the brink of death. Some were so weak they could barely walk. The sight of the fresh horses and the packs of dried fish was like a vision of heaven. The relief was overwhelming. The Nez Perce hadn't just saved Clark's small party. They had saved the entire expedition from certain annihilation. This act of kindness was a pivotal turning point in the entire journey. Recovering among the Nez Perce, the men slowly regained their health, though the rich diet of salmon and roots made many of them sick after weeks of starvation. Here, on the banks of the Clearwater River, they abandoned their horses and, with the help of the Nez Perce, began constructing new dugout canoes. The mountains were behind them. Before them lay a new highway, the river system that would, they hoped, finally carry them to the Pacific Ocean. The darkest chapter was over, but the final push to the sea was just beginning, filled with new challenges and wonders. This incredible story of endurance and survival in the Rocky Mountains is a powerful testament to the human spirit. It highlights the crucial role that Native American tribes, like the Shoshone and Nez Perce, played in the success of the expedition. Without their help, the story of Lewis and Clark would have ended frozen in the Bitterroot snows. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The courage and resilience of the corps in the face of such overwhelming odds is truly humbling. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll follow the canoes down the river toward the Great Pacific. We'll see you next time. Hello and welcome back to our journey retracing the steps of Lewis and Clark. When we last left the corps of Discovery, they had just crossed the formidable continental divide. Imagine their relief, their bone-deep weariness mixed with a surge of renewed hope. They had conquered the spine of the continent, but the real test, the one that would determine the success of their entire mission, was just beginning. Finding a waterway to the Pacific Ocean. This is Chapter 14. Finding the rivers of the West. The air on the western side of the Rockies was different, thinner, crisper. The landscape, while still rugged, began to slope downward. For weeks, the expedition had been fighting gravity, pushing upstream against the powerful Missouri River. Now, for the first time in months, gravity was their ally. Every stream, every trickle of water they encountered, was flowing west. It was a profound psychological shift. They were no longer pushing against the continent. They were flowing with it. On August 12, 1805, Lewis stood at Lamhi Pass. He drank from a spring that he knew, with absolute certainty, was feeding the great Columbia River and, eventually, the Pacific Ocean. He described it as tasting the waters of the Pacific. This wasn't just geography. It was destiny unfolding. He had found the fabled Northwest Passage, not as a single, easy river, but as a complex network of streams and mountains, a path nonetheless. But this moment of triumph was short. The reality of their situation quickly set in. They were exhausted, their supplies were dwindling, and they were in the territory of unknown Native American tribes. Their Shoshone guide, Toby, had promised a river journey, but the river they first encountered, the Lamea, was too shallow and fast for their heavy dugout canoes. They needed horses, and they needed help. This is where their encounter with the Shoshone people, Sacagawea's own tribe, became the pivotal moment of the entire expedition. As we discussed, the reunion between Sacagawea and her brother, Chief Kamehameha, was a miracle of timing. Without it, the story might have ended right here, in the bitter cold of the Rocky Mountains. Chief Kamehameha, though welcoming, was skeptical. He listened to Lewis's grand speeches about a great white father in the East and promises of trade, but his people were starving. The Samoan had not yet arrived in force, and they were preparing to cross the mountains themselves to hunt buffalo. Selling their precious horses was a huge risk. It was Sacagawea's presence, her vouching for the strangers, that tipped the scales. She was the bridge of trust between two vastly different worlds. After tense negotiations, they managed to acquire the horses they desperately needed, but the captains still held on to the dream of a water route. Clark, ever the pragmatist, set out with a small party to scout the nearby Salmon River. What he found was a nightmare. He described it as foaming and roaring through rocks in every direction. The river was a torrent of white water, walled in by sheer cliffs. It was utterly impassable by boat. Toby, their guide, confirmed their fears. No one, he said, dared to travel that river. This was a crushing blow. The plan had always been to float to the Pacific. Now, they were faced with a second, even more treacherous mountain crossing. The Bitterroot Range, the Shoshone, warned them against it, describing a perilous, snow-covered trail with no game to hunt. They called it the road to the buffalo, but for the Corps, it would be a road of starvation and desperation. There was no other choice. They traded 4 more horses, packed their gear, and on August 30th, 1805, they turned their backs on the Salmon River, which Clark grimly named for Captain Lewis, and headed north towards the Lolo Trail and the unforgiving Bitterroot Mountains. The journey that followed would be the most harrowing ordeal of the entire expedition. They climbed into a world of snow and ice, even though it was only September. The trail, barely visible, clung to the sides of steep ridges. Horses slipped and fell, sometimes tumbling hundreds of feet down the mountainside, taking precious cargo with them. Game completely disappeared. They were forced to eat their pack horses, one by one. Soon, even that ran out. The men grew weak, suffering from frostbite, dysentery, and near-total starvation. They ate anything they could find: rosips, boiled moccasins, and even tallow candles. The indomitable spirit of the Corps was pushed to its absolute limit. In his journal, Clark wrote simply, "I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life." At their lowest point, when it seemed they might all perish in the snowy wilderness, Clark made a bold decision. He took a small advance party and pushed ahead, a desperate gamble to find food and help. It was a race against time. After days of brutal travel, Clark and his men stumbled out of the mountains and into a clearing. There, they saw a sight that must have felt like a dream. The lodges of the Nez Perce tribe. Exhausted and emaciated, they were taken in by the tribe, who shared what little food they had: dried salmon and camas roots. The Nez Perce, particularly a chief named Twisted Hair, were astounded by these strangers. An elderly woman, who had been taken captive and lived among white people years before, urged her tribe to treat the expedition with kindness. Her intervention may very well have saved all their lives. When Lewis and the rest of the starving party finally staggered out of the mountains, the Nez Perce nursed them back to health. The sudden change in diet from near starvation to rich salmon and roots made many of the men violently ill, but they were alive. They had survived the bitter. Here, with the Nez Perce, their luck finally turned. Twisted Hair and other chiefs confirmed what they had longed to hear. A nearby river, the Clearwater, flowed into a larger one, the Snake, which in turn flowed into the great river of the West, Columbia. Their water route to the Pacific was real, and it was within their grasp. The men's spirits soared. Under the guidance of the Nez they set about building new canoes, using fire to hollow out massive ponderosa pine logs. They branded their horses and left them in the care of the tribe, promising to return the following spring. It was a remarkable show of trust on both sides. Finally, on October 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery pushed their 5 new canoes into the Clearwater River. The current, for the first time, was carrying them westward. They were on their way. The journey down the Clearwater, the Snake, and finally the mighty Columbia was swift and exhilarating, but not without its own dangers. They navigated treacherous rapids, like the short and long narrows of the Dalles, where the entire Columbia River funnels through a narrow, turbulent channel. Along the way, they met numerous tribes, Dayak, the Walla Walla, the Sinukal, part of a vast and ancient trading network centered on the river. The river was their highway, their grocery store, their entire world. The sight of dozens of canoes and villages bustling with activity was a revelation to the Corps. They were no longer in the empty wilderness. They were in a populated and thriving land. As they drifted further west, the landscape changed again. The dry, arid plains gave way to a lush, green world of giant trees and constant drizzle. They began to see coastal birds. They met Chinookan people wearing woven hats to shed the rain. And then, on November 7th, 1805, after a night of being pinned down by a furious storm, the fog lifted. Clark, in one of the most famous entries of the entire journey, wrote, "Ocean in view. Oh, the joy." They had made it. They had crossed the continent. They had found the Pacific Ocean. But their journey was far from over. They now faced a wet, miserable winter on the coast before having to do it all over again. Thank you for joining us for this crucial chapter in the Lewis and Clark saga. The courage it took to cross those mountains is almost unimaginable. If you're enjoying the series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue to tell these incredible stories. We'll see you next time, as the Corps of Discovery hunkers down for a long winter at Fort Clatsop. 1930, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, our expedition was on its last legs. The Bitterroot Mountains had taken their toll, leaving us gaunt, frostbitten, and utterly exhausted. Every step was a monumental effort, our bodies screaming in protest against the biting cold and the gnawing hunger that had become our constant companion. We had pushed ourselves to the very brink of human endurance, and frankly, hope was a flickering ember, close to being extinguished by the harsh wilderness. Our supplies were long gone, and the specter of starvation loomed over us, a silent, terrifying predator. We were lost, not just in the geographical sense, but lost in a sea of despair, unsure if we would ever see another sunrise. Each member of the party was a ghost of their former self, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving every last ounce of energy. The vibrant spirit of our journey had been replaced by a grim, silent determination to simply survive one more hour, one more day. 2030, just as we were about to surrender to the inevitable, a figure appeared on the horizon. Then another, and another. It was a scouting party. Our hearts hammered in our chests. Was this salvation or the final blow? As they drew closer, we saw their faces. They were Nez Perce. We had heard stories of their strength and their connection to this land, but we didn't know what to expect. We were weak, vulnerable, a ragged group of outsiders encroaching on their territory. We braced ourselves, our hands instinctively hovering near our depleted cache of weapons, a futile gesture given our condition. But instead of hostility, we saw something incredible in their eyes. Curiosity, and then compassion. They didn't see invaders. They saw fellow human beings in desperate need. Their leader, a man whose presence commanded respect, approached us cautiously. There was a long, silent moment where the fate of our entire expedition hung in the balance. A moment suspended in the crisp mountain air. 2130 without a shared language. Communication was a challenge, but the language of desperation is universal. We pointed to our empty stomachs, our frostbitten hands, our exhausted bodies slumped against the snow-dusted pines. They understood immediately. A quiet discussion took place among them, their voices a low murmur that we couldn't comprehend but which carried a tone of deliberation, not aggression. Then, With a series of gestures, they invited us to follow. It was a leap of faith. We had no choice but to trust them. Mustering the last of our strength, we stumbled after them, our worn-out boots sinking into the snow. They led us patiently, adjusting their pace to match our agonizingly slow shuffle. Every step towards their camp was a step away from the brink of death, a step towards a warmth we thought we'd never feel again. The relief that washed over us was so profound it was almost painful. 20 to 30 we arrived at their village, a collection of well-constructed lodges nestled in a sheltered valley. The sight was surreal, a haven of life and warmth in the middle of this unforgiving wilderness. The aroma of roasting meat and camas root filled the air, a scent so intoxicating it made our heads spin. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' legs, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. The entire village seemed to turn out to see the strange, skeletal men who had emerged from the mountains. There was no menace, only a quiet, dignified observation. We were led to a lodge, and the women of the tribe immediately set to work. They brought us blankets woven from animal hides, thick and warm, and bowls of rich, nourishing stew. That first taste of food was a revelation. It was more than just sustenance. It was an act of profound kindness, a gift of life itself. 2330, the Nez Perce didn't just feed us. They nursed us back to health. Their knowledge of the land and its resources was astonishing. They used local plants to create salves for our frostbite and sores, their medicine proving far more effective than anything we had in our depleted medical kits. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, tended to our wounds with gentle, practiced hands. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice soft and soothing, and though we couldn't understand her words, we understood her intent. She was healing us. The men shared their knowledge of the local terrain, drawing maps in the dirt with sticks, showing us the safest routes through the mountains we had so foolishly tried to conquer on our own. They showed us which routes were edible, how to track game, and how to read the signs of the weather. 2430 over the next few days. Our strength slowly returned. Our hollow cheeks began to fill out, and the light returned to our eyes. We began to interact more with our hosts, sharing what little we had, a few metal trinkets, some buttons as tokens of our immense gratitude. They accepted them with grace, but it was clear they expected nothing in return. Their generosity was unconditional. We learned so much from just observing their way of life. We saw the deep respect they had for nature, the intricate social bonds that held their community together, and the wisdom passed down through generations. They were not the savages that some had described, but a sophisticated and deeply spiritual people living in perfect harmony with their environment. Their kindness was a humbling lesson, a stark contrast to the brutal indifference of the mountains we had just barely survived. 25 minutes and 30 seconds, I remember one evening, sitting by the fire, watching the children play. An elder sat beside me, and through a mix of gestures and the few words we had managed to teach each other, he shared stories of his people, of the spirits of the mountains and the rivers. He spoke of balance, of taking only what you need, and of the interconnectedness of all living things. It was a philosophy born from centuries of living in this land, a wisdom that we, in our rush to conquer and claim, had completely overlooked. Looking into the flames, I felt a profound sense of gratitude that went beyond just being saved from starvation. We had been given a glimpse into a different world, a different way of being. This encounter had changed us, reshaped our perspective on the world and our place in it. 26 minutes and 30 seconds, when the time came for us to leave. It was with a heavy heart. We were physically restored, our bodies healed and our packs filled with dried fish and camas cakes, a generous gift to see us through the next leg of our journey. But more importantly, our spirits had been renewed. We tried to express our thanks, but our words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving your life, for showing you a level of humanity you didn't know existed? The chief, whose name we learned was Twisted Hair, simply nodded, a look of quiet understanding in his eyes. He and a few of his warriors guided us down from the mountains, leading us to a river that would carry us westward, towards our final destination. They had not only saved us from the brink of death, but it also set us back on our path, equipped with new knowledge and a renewed sense of purpose. 27 minutes and 30 seconds as we paddled away. We looked back at the figures standing on the riverbank. They watched us until we rounded a bend and were out of sight. The memory of the Nez Perce, of their quiet dignity and their extraordinary generosity, would be etched into our minds forever. They were a testament to the fact that in the midst of the harshest landscapes, the greatest source of strength and salvation can be found in the kindness of the human heart. Our encounter with them was not just a chapter in our journey. It was a pivotal moment that redefined the very meaning of our expedition. We came seeking a route to the Pacific, but we found something far more valuable. A profound lesson in compassion, resilience, and the shared bonds of humanity. 28 minutes and 30 seconds we owe our lives to the Nez Perce. It's as simple as that. Without their intervention, our story would have ended there. A tragic footnote in the history of exploration. Our bones scattered in the merciless Bitterroot Mountains. Their kindness was a beacon of light in our darkest hour. As we continued our journey, we carried their gifts with us. Not just the food and the maps, but the memory of their humanity. A memory that would warm us on cold nights and guide us through the challenges that still lay ahead. Thank you so much for joining us for this part of the story. Your support means the world to us. If you're finding value in this journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these stories to life. We'll see you in the next chapter. Start of narration. All right, everyone. Welcome back. When we last left our weary travelers, they had just overcome one of the most grueling stretches of their journey. Morale was low, supplies were nearly gone, and the path ahead seemed to stretch into an unforgiving infinity. But as we step into this next chapter, the long march to the Pacific, something fundamental has shifted. It's no longer just about survival. It's about a destination, a promise whispered on the wind, a destination they weren't even sure was real. The Great Western Sea. Imagine waking up not to the gentle rays of dawn, but to the relentless drumming of rain against your makeshift shelter. Day after day, a cold, persistent drizzle soaked everything they owned. Their clothes were perpetually damp, clinging to their skin like a second, colder layer. Fires became a luxury, a constant battle against the damp wood and soggy tinder. The simple act of cooking a meager meal turned into an hour-long ordeal, often ending in smoky, half-cooked rations that did little to warm their chilled bones. The landscape itself seemed to weep with them. The once firm trails dissolved into treacherous rivers of mud. Each step was a struggle. The thick, clay-like mud would suck at their boots, trying to pull them down, to hold them back. It caked their trousers, weighed down their packs, and splattered their faces. The world was a uniform shade of gray and brown, a monotonous, draining environment that tested their resolve far more than any single mountain peak or raging river ever had. It wasn't a dramatic, life-or-death struggle, but a slow, grinding erosion of spirit. And then there was the hunger, not the temporary pang of a missed meal, but a deep, gnawing emptiness that became their constant companion. Their painstakingly gathered supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The land, waterlogged and cold, offered little in return. Game was scarce, having hunkered down to wait out the endless rain. Edible plants were hard to identify, buried under layers of wet leaves and mud. They were down to their last handfuls of dried grains and jerky, rationing each bite with a discipline born of sheer desperation. Every evening, huddled together for warmth, the conversation would inevitably turn to food, not just the memory of it, but the dream of it. They would describe in painstaking detail the taste of a warm loaf of bread, the sizzle of meat in a pan, the simple sweetness of a fresh-picked apple. These weren't just conversations, they were incantations, spells cast against the encroaching despair. They were feeding their minds because they couldn't feed their bodies. The hunger was a physical ache, but the real battle was fighting the mental fog that it created, the lethargy that whispered for them to just stop, to lie down and let the rain wash over them. Yet, within this crucible of misery, a strange and powerful thing began to blossom. Hope. It wasn't a loud, boisterous hope, but a quiet, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. It lived in the small moments. A shared piece of jerky, offered without a word, a helping hand extended to pull a comrade from the mud, a weak, but genuine, smile exchanged across a sputtering fire. They had been forged into a unit, a family bound not by blood, but by shared hardship. They understood each other's silence, recognized the look of exhaustion in each other's eyes, and knew, without asking, when someone needed their load lightened, even just for a few hundred yards. This hope was fueled by a single, powerful idea. The ocean. The Pacific. It was more than just a body of water. It was the finish line. It was the symbol of an end to the mud, the rain, and the hunger. It was the promise of a new beginning. They talked about it constantly. What would it look like? Would it truly be as vast as the stories claimed? Would the air taste of salt? These questions became their mantra, their reason to put one foot in front of the other when every muscle screamed in protest. The Pacific wasn't just a place on a map. It was an idea, a dream that pulled them forward when everything else was pushing them back. The days blurred into one another, a relentless cycle of waking, walking, and sleeping in the damp cold. But then, one afternoon, something changed. The air, which had been heavy and thick with moisture for weeks, began to feel different. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the breeze. It carried a new scent, something clean and sharp, with a faint, briny tang that was entirely unfamiliar. It cut through the familiar smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. They paused, lifting their heads and sniffing the air like animals sensing a change in the season. A murmur of excitement rippled through the group. Could it be? They pressed on, their pace quickening. The exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The terrain began to shift as well. The dense, dripping forests started to thin, and the ground underfoot became safe. The perpetual gray canopy above them seemed to brighten, as if the sun were fighting to break through. The roar of the wind in the trees began to sound different, deeper, more rhythmic. It wasn't just the sound of wind anymore. It was the sound of a constant, powerful surge. They scrambled up one final, sandy ridge, their hearts pounding in their chests with a mixture of effort and frantic anticipation. They pushed through a last line of wind-stunted pines, the branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and then they stopped. Before them, the world fell away. There are no words in any language that could have prepared them for the sight. It wasn't a river, or a lake, or anything they had ever known. It was everything. Everything. An endless, impossible expanse of churning. Deep blue waters stretched to the horizon, meeting the sky in a seamless, hazy line. It was alive, breathing in and out with a slow, powerful rhythm. Great lines of white foam, the crests of waves, rolled towards them, one after another, before crashing onto a wide, pale beach in a thunderous roar that vibrated through the soles of their feet and up into their chests. The sheer scale of it was beyond comprehension. It made the mountains they had crossed seem like small hills. The great rivers they had forded looked like tiny streams. This was a force of nature on a completely different level, vast and wild and utterly magnificent. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the roar of the surf and the cry of gulls circling overhead. The rain had stopped. A sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting a shimmering path of gold across the water's surface. Tears began to stream down their faces, mingling with the salt spray that misted the air. But these were not tears of sorrow or exhaustion. They were tears of pure, unadulterated awe and relief. They had made it. They had walked across a continent. They had endured the unendurable. And this was their reward. Slowly, as if in a trance, they began to walk down the sandy slope towards the water. Some stumbled their legs, weak with emotion. Others broke into a run, letting out whoops and hollers that were swallowed by the ocean's roar. They threw down their heavy packs, shedding the burdens they had carried for so long. They reached the edge of the water, where the waves hissed and foamed around their worn-out boots. One by one, they knelt down. They plunged their hands into the cold, churning water and splashed it on their faces, washing away the dirt, the sweat, and the weariness of 1,000 miles. They tasted the salt on their lips, the taste of their destination, the taste of victory. They had done it. They had reached the Pacific. The long march was over. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible part of the journey. It's moments like these that truly define what the human spirit is capable of. If you were moved by their story, please hit that like button. And do you forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you miss the next chapter of this amazing adventure. We'll see you next time. The journey west had been brutal, a grueling test of will against the vast, unforgiving American wilderness. But now, as 1805 drew to a close, Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery had finally reached their goal, the Pacific Ocean. The endless expanse of water was a sight to behold, a moment of profound triumph. But celebration was short-lived. A new, formidable enemy loomed on the horizon. Winter. The coastal winds were relentless. The rain was a constant, chilling companion, and the Pacific storms were ferocious. Survival demanded shelter, a bastion against the elements. The decision was made near what is now Astoria, Oregon. Here, on the south side of the Columbia River, they would build their winter home. Before a single log was cut, a historic vote was taken. On November 24th, 1805, every member of the expedition, including York, Clark's enslaved man, and Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman, who had been invaluable to their journey, was asked to vote on the location of their winter fort. It was a remarkable, unprecedented moment of democracy in the wild, a testament to the respect and camaraderie forged over thousands of miles. The majority chose a site with ample elk for hunting and tall timber for building. The work began immediately. Axes rang out through the dense, damp forest as the men felled towering fir trees. They were building not just a shelter, but a fortress against the misery of a Pacific Northwest winter. They named it Fort Clatsop, in honor of the local Clatsop tribe, who were their neighbors in this strange, new land. By Christmas Eve, the fort was habitable, though far from finished. The structure was a classic frontier design. 2 long cabins facing each other, connected by a palisade wall, to form a rectangular compound. It measured about 50 feet square. One side housed the 3 sergeants and their squads, while the other held quarters for Lewis and Clark, the Sarbeno family including Sacagawea, and her infant son, Gian Baptiste, and a storage room for their precious supplies. A sturdy gate at each end provided access and security. Christmas Day, 1805, was a somber affair. The men exchanged meager gifts and tobacco, a handkerchief and fired a volley from their rifles to mark the occasion. But the endless rain and the monotonous diet were beginning to wear on everyone's spirits. The men were constantly soaked, their leather clothing rotting from the dampness. Fleas infested their bedding, making rest nearly impossible. Sickness began to creep through the camp, with colds, influenza, and rheumatism becoming common complaints. The primary task during this long winter was survival. Hunting parties were sent out daily, braving the treacherous terrain and foul weather in search of elk. Elk became the cornerstone of their existence. Its meat provided sustenance, its hide was used to make new clothing and moccasins, and its tallow was rendered into candles, providing precious light during the long, dark nights. But Clark noted in his journal that the men grew tired of the lean elk meat, longing for the fatty richness of buffalo they had enjoyed on the plains. The dampness also made it difficult to properly smoke and preserve the meat, leading to it was a constant battle to keep their larders stocked and their spirits up. Beyond mere survival, the captains knew this time was an invaluable opportunity. The mission's scientific and cartographic goals had to continue. Inside the smoky, fire-lit rooms of Fort Clatsop, Lewis and Clark turned their quarters into a scientific headquarters. Lewis, the naturalist, dedicated himself to his collections. He meticulously documented the flora and fauna of the region. He described the massive Oregon firs, the shore pines, and the various ferns and shrubs that thrived in the coastal rainforest. He wrote detailed descriptions of animals new to American science, like the massive California condor and the resourceful sea otter. Each entry in his journal was a piece of a vast puzzle, painting a picture of a world previously unknown to the young United States. Meanwhile, Clark, the master cartographer, set to work on his maps, using the celestial observations, measurements, and sketches he had painstakingly recorded since leaving St. Louis. He began to create the most accurate map of the American West ever produced. He consolidated his notes, interviewed local tribes like the Clatsop and Chinook, to understand the river systems and coastal geography, and slowly, painstakingly, brought the shape of the continent into focus on paper. His work would literally redraw the map of North America. The journals were the lifeblood of the expedition, the official record of their discoveries. Every day, regardless of the weather, the sickness, or the sheer monotony, the captains and several of the sergeants wrote. They recorded daily weather patterns, encounters with local tribes, the health of the men, and their own personal reflections. These journals are now a national treasure, a window into the day-to-day reality of their epic undertaking. They documented everything from the price of a basket of roots to the complex social structures of the coastal peoples. Their interactions with the local tribes, like the Clatsop and the Chinook, were a mixed bag. Trade was essential. The Corps needed food, especially the wapato roots that were a staple of the local diet, and the tribes were interested in metal goods, beads, and cloth. But the relationship was often tense. The coastal tribes were shrewd traders, and the Corps' supply of trade goods was dwindling. There were instances of theft and misunderstanding, leading to a general air of mistrust on both sides. Despite the friction, these interactions provided invaluable ethnographic information that the captains carefully recorded. As the weeks turned into months, the routine of Fort Clatsop became a grinding cycle of hunting, fetching firewood, standing guard, and enduring the rain. Morale was a constant concern. To combat the gloom, the men would play music on the fiddle, dance, and tell stories around the fire. It was these small moments of levity that held the group together, reinforcing the bonds of brotherhood that were their greatest strength. By March, signs of spring began to appear. The days grew longer, the rain became less constant, and the first green shoots emerged from the forest floor. The thoughts of the entire party turned eastward, towards home. They had spent 106 days at Fort Clatsop, 106 days of rain, hunger, and hard work. They had survived. On March 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery packed their canoes, gifted Fort Clatsop to the local Clatsop chief, Sacagawea, and pushed off into the Columbia River, beginning the long and arduous journey home. They left behind their winter fortress, but they carried with them the detailed maps, the scientific specimens, and the priceless knowledge gathered during those long, dark months. The winter at Fort Clatsop was not just a period of survival. It was a period of intense intellectual labor that fulfilled one of the primary missions of the expedition. They had mapped the way to the Pacific, and now they would show America the way. Thank you so much for joining us on this part of the journey. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more chapters of this incredible saga, and share it with a friend. We'll see you next time as the Corps of Discovery begins its epic race home. Finally, after a long, damp winter camped on the Pacific coast, the spring of 1806 arrived. The scent of new growth was in the air, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose for the Corps of Discovery. Their mission was accomplished. They had reached the great Western Ocean. Now, only one thing remained: the journey home. On March 23, 1806, the men eagerly packed their canoes and pushed off from the shore, leaving Fort Clatsop behind forever. The mood was electric. Every paddle stroke, every step eastward, was a step closer to family, friends, and the world they had left behind nearly 2 years ago. The journey west had been into the great unknown, a constant battle against uncertainty. But the journey east, this was a return, a triumphant march homeward. As they retraced their steps up the Columbia River, the landscape that had once seemed so foreign and imposing now felt familiar. They navigated the same rapids, passed the same landmarks, and met with many of the same Native American tribes they had encountered on their way out. This time, however, the interactions were different. The Corps were no longer just strangers passing through. They were seasoned travelers who had seen the other side of the continent. Their stories, and the very fact of their return, earned them a new level of respect and curiosity. Reaching the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, they arrived at Traveler's Rest, a familiar campsite in modern-day Montana. Here, Captain Lewis and Captain Clark made a bold and strategic decision to maximize their exploration and map as much of this vast territory as possible on their return. They would divide the Corps. This was a calculated risk. Splitting their forces meant smaller, more vulnerable groups, but the potential rewarded wealth of new geographical knowledge was too great to ignore. Captain Lewis would lead a more direct northern route. His plan was to cross the Rockies and explore the Marias River, a tributary of the Missouri. He hoped this river might extend further north, possibly into British territory, which would have significant implications for trade and territorial claims. This was a dangerous shortcut, a path that would take him through the heart of Blackfeet territory, a powerful and notoriously wary tribe. Meanwhile, Captain Clark would take the larger contingent, including Sacagawea and her family, on a southern route. His group would travel back down to the Three Forks of the Missouri, where Clark would then lead a party overland to explore the Yellowstone River, a major waterway that had only been described to them by Native Americans. Sergeant Ordway would take a third group down the Missouri River to rendezvous with Lewis's party at the Great Falls. It was a complex, three-pronged plan designed to cover an immense amount of ground. As the two groups prepared to part ways on July 3rd, there was a palpable sense of both excitement and apprehension. They were venturing into separate unknowns once again. For weeks, they would be out of contact, relying on their skills, their wits, and the hope of a successful reunion downriver. Lewis shook Clark's hand, wished him well, and turned his horse north. Clark watched his friend disappear over the ridge before leading his own men south. The final, daring chapter of their exploration had begun. Lewis's detachment pushed north, making good time. The journey over the mountains was arduous but successful. They reached the Marias River and began to follow its course. Lewis was meticulous in his observations, mapping the river and documenting the flora and fauna. However, the shadow of the Blackfeet loomed large. His small party was on high alert, knowing that an encounter was almost inevitable. That encounter came on July 26th. Lewis and his three companions came across a small group of 8 Blackfeet warriors. Following protocol, Lewis approached peacefully, explaining they were Americans and wished for peace and trade. The two groups agreed to camp together for the night, but the atmosphere was tense. The Blackfeet were interested in the cores, rifles, and horses, and Lewis knew it. Before dawn, the situation exploded. The Blackfeet made a move to steal the Americans' guns and horses. A desperate struggle ensued. In the chaotic moments that followed, 2 of the Blackfeet warriors were killed. It was the only violent and fatal encounter with a native tribe during the entire 2-year expedition. Shaken but unharmed, Lewis and his men knew they couldn't stay. They immediately grabbed their horses and rode for their lives, not stopping for nearly 24 hours straight, covering an astonishing 100 miles. They rode relentlessly, fearing a larger war party was in pursuit. Their only goal now was to reach the Missouri River and the safety of the rendezvous point. While Lewis was racing for his life, Clark's journey down the Yellowstone was proving to be a resounding success. The river was broad and navigable, just as he had hoped. His team constructed new canoes and floated downstream with relative ease, mapping this vital waterway for the first time. Along the way, Clark marveled at the incredible sights, including a peculiar rock formation on the riverbank. He carved his name in the Dechola, 25th 80 no, 6 and 2. The sandstone. Today, we know it as Pompey's Pillar, the only remaining physical evidence of the cores of discoveries passing on the entire trail. It stands as a silent monument to their epic journey. Finally, after weeks of separation and high drama, the groups began to converge. Sergeant Ordway's group, having navigated the Missouri, successfully reunited with Lewis's exhausted party. A few days later, on August 12th, they spotted another group of canoes coming down the river. It was Clark and his men. The cause of discovery was whole once again. The relief and joy were immense. They exchanged stories of their separate adventures of close calls, new discoveries, and the shared, unyielding drive that had seen them all through. With the entire party reunited on the Missouri River, the current was now their greatest ally. The river that had been a formidable adversary on the journey west now carried them swiftly downstream. They were making incredible time, covering 50, 60, sometimes even 70 miles in a single day. Every bend in the river brought them closer to home. They passed through the familiar lands of the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. Here, they had to say their goodbyes. Sacagawea, her husband, Tusan Charbano, and their young son, Jean Baptistito Pampud, go no further. They had fulfilled their duty and were now returning to their life with a hadassah. It was a poignant farewell. This young woman and her child had been an integral part of the expedition, a symbol of peace and an invaluable guide. Clark, who had grown incredibly fond of young Baptiste, made a heartfelt offer to raise and educate the boy in St. Louis. It was an offer that, years later, would be accepted. The Corps pushed off, leaving their friends on the riverbank, their journey now truly nearing its end. The final weeks were a blur of river miles. On September 23, 1806, after 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, the weathered canoes of the Corps of Discovery rounded a bend in the river, and the small frontier settlement of St. Louis came into view. The townspeople, who had long given them up for dead, stared in disbelief. Shouts erupted, and soon the entire village was rushing to the riverbank to welcome the heroes home. They had done it. They had crossed the continent and returned against all odds, with journals full of priceless information, maps that would shape the future of a nation, and stories that would echo through history. The great journey was over. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible expedition across the American West. The story of Lewis and Clark is a testament to human courage, curiosity, and endurance. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. We'll see you next time. September 23, 1806. Imagine the scene in St. Louis. It's a bustling frontier town on the edge of the known world. For over 2 long years, there has been silence, complete and utter silence. From the Corps of Discovery, 40-plus souls, led by Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, had vanished into the vast, uncharted West. Most people had given them up for dead. They were a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered on the banks of the Missouri. The mission, it was assumed, had ended in disaster. The West had swallowed them whole. Then, on that September morning, a lookout on the riverfront spotted something. A few rough-hewn canoes, paddled by men who looked more like wild mountain dwellers than soldiers. Their skin was tanned to leather by the sun and wind, their hair long and unruly, and their buckskin clothes were worn and tattered. But as they drew closer, a murmur turned into a shout, and the shout turned into a roar that echoed through the entire town. It was them. Lewis and Clark had returned. The people of St. Louis poured out of their homes, shops, and taverns, rushing to the riverbank. They couldn't believe their eyes. These weren't ghosts. They were flesh and blood, thin and weathered, but alive. The cheers were deafening. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated joy and disbelief. It was as if the dead had walked back into the world of the living. Lewis, ever the formal officer, fired a salute from their blunderbusses, and the fort on the hill answered with its cannon. The celebration had begun. The captains were immediately swamped with questions. Where have you been? What did you see? Did you find a water route to the Pacific? And the most important question of all, did you make it? Yes, they had. They had crossed the entire continent and stood on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. They had faced grizzly bears, starvation, treacherous rapids, and negotiated with dozens of Native American nations, most of whom had never seen a white man before. They brought back stories that sounded like myths. Tales of towering mountains that scraped the sky and vast plains teeming with buffalo. But they brought back more than just stories. Their canoes were laden with priceless treasures, not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable, knowledge. They carried crates filled with journals, detailed maps, and scientific specimens. They had meticulously documented hundreds of new plant and animal species, from the prairie dog to the coyote. They had mapped the rivers, the mountains, and the valleys, charting a path through a land that had previously been a complete mystery on European maps. Think about the sheer scale of their achievement. In 28 months, they had traveled over 8,000 miles, mostly by human power paddling, pushing and pulling their boats against the relentless current of the Missouri, or trekking on foot over the formidable Rocky Mountains. They did this without modern technology, without GPS, without any real certainty of what lay ahead. Their only guides were their compasses, their sextants, the stars, and the advice they gathered from the indigenous peoples they met along the way. Their return marked the official end of one of the most audacious and successful explorations in human history. They didn't find the easy Northwest Passage that Jefferson had dreamed of, because it didn't exist. Instead, they revealed the true face of the American West, a land of immense beauty, incredible resources, and formidable challenges. They had lifted the veil on a continent. The information they gathered would shape the future of the United States for the next century and beyond, fueling the westward expansion that would define the nation's identity. In the days that followed, Lewis and Clark were celebrated as national heroes. They wrote letters to President Jefferson, announcing their safe return and the success of their mission. Lewis wrote, "In obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean." It's a simple, modest sentence that barely hints at the epic journey behind it. The mission was complete. They had gone into the wilderness as explorers and returned as legends. The map of America would never be the same again. They had not just mapped the West. They had redrawn the boundaries of possibility and forever changed the American imagination. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through history. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more fascinating chapters from the past, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We've got so much more to share with you. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through history. After 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, the Corps of Discovery finally returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806. Their arrival was met with astonishment and celebration. Most had given them up for dead, but here they were, weathered and worn, but triumphant. The news of their safe return spread like wildfire across the young nation, bringing with it a wave of excitement and national pride. President Thomas Jefferson, who had orchestrated this ambitious venture, was overjoyed. His vision had been realized, and the mysteries of the vast Louisiana Purchase were beginning to unravel. The men of the expedition, once ordinary soldiers and frontiersmen, were now national heroes. Their incredible journey was over, but their story and its impact was just beginning. So, what exactly did they bring back? It wasn't gold or jewels, but something far more valuable: knowledge. The expedition produced an incredible wealth of scientific and geographic information. Lewis and Clark, with meticulous care, had charted the course of the Missouri River, crossed the formidable Rocky Mountains, and followed the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. Their maps were a revelation. For the first time, Americans had a detailed and reasonably accurate picture of the Western continent. They mapped nearly 8,000 miles of territory, correcting long-held myths and filling in the vast blank spaces on the map. These charts became the essential guide for the trappers, traders, and settlers who would follow in their footsteps, opening the door for westward expansion. They provided the practical roadmap that would shape the nation's destiny for the next century. But the legacy goes far beyond lines on a map. The journals kept by Lewis, Clark, and several other members of the Corps are a national treasure. These day-by-day accounts offer an unfiltered, first-hand look at the American West as it was before widespread settlement. They are a vivid tapestry of adventure, hardship, and discovery. In their pages we read about the thrill of encountering grizzly bears for the first time, the struggle of portaging around the great falls of the Missouri, the desperation of near starvation in the bitter mountains, and the awe of finally reaching the Pacific. These journals are more than just historical documents. They are compelling works of literature, capturing the human drama of the expedition. They allow us to travel alongside these brave explorers, to see the world through their eyes, and to feel the pulse of their incredible journey. The scientific discoveries were equally profound. Lewis and Clark were tasked by Jefferson to observe and document everything they could. They described at least 178 new species of plants and 122 species of animals, previously unknown to American science. From the prairie dog to the pronghorn antelope, from the bitterroot plant to the Osage orange, their findings dramatically expanded the understanding of North America's biodiversity. They collected specimens, seeds, and skins, which were sent back to Jefferson and other leading scientists of the day. This treasure trove of natural history information fueled scientific inquiry for decades and laid the groundwork for future studies of Western flora and fauna. They were not just explorers. They were pioneering naturalists who opened a new chapter in American science. Perhaps one of the most complex and important aspects of their legacy is their interaction with the Native American tribes. The expedition encountered nearly 50 different tribes, each with its own unique culture, language, and traditions. The journals provide an invaluable ethnographic record of these peoples at a crucial moment in history, just before their way of life was irrevocably changed by westward expansion. The success of the expedition was, in many ways, dependent on the assistance and guidance of these native peoples. The Shoshone, led by Sacagawea's brother, provided the horses essential for crossing the Rockies. The Nez Perce saved the Crows from starvation and cared for their horses over the winter. The Mandan Hidatsa offered a safe haven during their first winter on the plains. The story of Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman who accompanied them with her infant son, has become legendary. Her skills as an interpreter, her knowledge of the land, and simply her presence as a woman with a child signaled to other tribes that the Corps was a peaceful party, not a war party. She was a symbol of diplomacy and a vital contributor to the expedition's success. The relationships formed, though temporary, were often based on mutual respect and cooperation. The expedition's record stands as a testament to the possibility of peaceful interaction, a stark contrast to the conflicts that would later dominate relations between settlers and Native Americans. It's a poignant reminder of a different path that might have been taken. The expedition also solidified America's claim to the Oregon Country. By traveling overland to the Pacific and establishing a winter camp, Fort Clatsop, they strengthened the United States' legal and political standing in the region against competing claims from Britain, Spain, and Russia. This was a crucial step in fulfilling America's manifest destiny to stretch from coast to coast. The diplomatic and geopolitical consequences of their journey were immense. It wasn't just an exploration. It was a strategic move on the chessboard of international politics, securing a continental future for the young republic. Their footsteps on the Pacific shore echoed in the halls of power and shaped the very borders of the nation we know today. Beyond the tangible outcomes, the maps, the scientific data, the diplomatic claims, the Lewis and Clark expedition left an enduring legacy on the American spirit. It is a quintessential American story. It's a story of courage in the face of the unknown, of perseverance through incredible hardship, and of the unquenchable human thirst for discovery. It's a story of teamwork, where men from different backgrounds came together, relied on one another, and accomplished a monumental task. The Corps of Discovery was a diverse group, and their ability to function as a cohesive unit was key to their survival and success. This spirit of adventure and discovery captured the national imagination and continues to inspire us. It reinforces the idea that with boldness, preparation, and cooperation, great things can be achieved. The expedition represents a moment of profound optimism and possibility in American history. It's a story that has been told and retold, inspiring countless books, films, and documentaries. It calls to the adventurer in all of us, reminding us of the vast, unexplored territories that exist not just on maps, but within science, art, and our own personal lives. The legacy isn't just about where they went. It's about the very act of going. In the end, the Lewis and Clark expedition was more than just a journey across a continent. It was a journey into the heart of America itself. It expanded not only the nation's physical boundaries, but also its understanding of its own potential. The knowledge they brought back transformed science, geography, and politics. The story they lived became a foundational myth, a source of national pride and inspiration that resonates to this day. From the detailed maps that guided a nation westward to the journals that preserve a lost world, the legacy of the Corps of Discovery is woven into the very fabric of America. It is a story of courage, cooperation, and the endless pursuit of the horizon, a story that, more than 2 centuries later, still inspires us to explore, to learn, and to dream. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible historical journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legacy of the expedition, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, keep exploring.